The room buzzed with tension. 4 quick grunts, a voice filled with frustration shouting, "Why can't anyone leave my hat alone?" and the sudden sound of a door slamming shut. Mr. Packington had left, rushing to catch his 8:45 train to the city. Mrs. Packington, still sitting at the breakfast table, seethed in silence. Her face was flushed with anger, her lips tight, and the only reason she wasn't crying was because the raw fury within her had drowned out any trace of sorrow. "I won't stand for this," Mrs. Packington hissed, her words sharp as a knife. She sat there, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, brooding in the deafening silence of the room. After a moment, her voice grew lower, trembling with rage and disbelief. That little minx, that nasty, sly cat. How could George be such a fool? Her anger was a fire, but it began to flicker and fade, and like a wave retreating, the grief came rushing back. A tear slid down her cheek, and then another, as her resolve broke, giving way to a sadness she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she whispered, "It's easy to say I won't stand for it, but what can I possibly do about it?" The weight of helplessness began to settle in her chest. The cold realization of being utterly alone struck her harder than any betrayal. She stared at the morning paper in her hands, and for the 100th time her eyes fell on the same advertisement, taunting her from the front page. Confidential. Are you unhappy? If so, consult Mr. Parker Pyne, 17 Richmond Street. Absurd, she muttered bitterly. Completely absurd. She tossed the paper aside, but then, almost out of desperation, a thought flickered through her mind. What if... The idea took root. And so, by 11 o'clock that very morning, Mrs. Packington found herself, nervously clutching her purse, walking into the private office of Mr. Parker Pyne. Her nerves were on edge, but when she laid eyes on him, something unexpected happened. Despite his formidable size, the bald head, and those piercing little eyes hidden behind thick glasses, she felt an odd sense of calm. His presence was reassuring, like a weight being lifted off her shoulders. "Please, sit down," Mr. Pyne said with a friendly smile. "I take it you're here in response to my advertisement?" His tone was warm and matter-of-fact, as though the answer was already clear. "Yes," Mrs. Packington replied, her voice trailing off, unsure of what to say next. "Ah," he nodded, as if he had expected this. "And you're unhappy. Very few people are, you know. In fact, you'd be surprised by how many people walk around carrying the burden of unhappiness." Mrs. Packington barely reacted to this statement. To her, the suffering of others hardly mattered right now. She was drowning in her own despair. "Not particularly interesting to you, I suppose," Mr. Pyne continued, his voice soft and patient. "But it's something I find quite fascinating. You see, for 35 years, I worked in compiling statistics in a government office. I've since retired, and I thought, why not put that experience to a more novel use? It's all rather simple. Unhappiness can be categorized into 5 main causes, nothing more than that. Once we understand the root cause, the solution becomes clear." Mrs. Packington blinked. Could it really be that simple? She wondered aloud. "Oh, yes," he said with certainty. "I stand where a doctor would. First, the diagnosis, then the treatment. In some cases, the treatment might not work, and in those instances I am upfront about it. But I assure you, Mrs. Packington, if I take on your case, the cure is practically guaranteed." She sat there, her mind racing. Could this man truly have the answer? Was he a charlatan, or was he speaking the truth? Her hope, though fragile, began to spark. "Let's begin the diagnosis, shall we?" Mr. Pyne suggested, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, his eyes narrowing as he focused on her. I believe the problem involves your husband. From what I can tell, you've had a happy marriage overall. Your husband has prospered. There's a young lady involved, isn't there? Perhaps a young woman from his office? A typist, I imagine? Mrs. Packington's eyes flared with recognition and disdain. A nasty, made-up little minx, she spat, her voice thick with contempt. All lipstick, silk stockings, and curls, that's all she is. Mr. Pine nodded knowingly, his tone unruffled. Ah, yes, your husband likely calls it nothing serious, just a little harmless friendship. He enjoys making her life a little brighter, bringing her a bit of joy. How kind of him, wouldn't you agree? Mrs. Packington's fury flared once again. Humbug. All of it's humbug. He used to say going out on the river interfered with his golf, but now, for her, he can take her there any time. And the theater, oh, don't get me started. He'd always say he was too tired, but now he's dancing with her until 3 a.m. She broke off, choking on the bitterness. Mr. Pine raised an eyebrow, his smile unwavering. And of course, he blames you for being jealous. Unreasonably jealous, I suspect. Mrs. Packington shot him a glare. Exactly. How do you know all this? Statistics, he replied simply. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were laced with frustration. I've done everything right for George. I worked hard when we had nothing. I helped him climb the ladder. I've been a good wife, faithful, supportive, and now, when we finally have the chance to enjoy life, to do the things I've dreamed of, this is what I get. Mr. Pine's expression softened, his gaze sincere. I understand your pain, Mrs. Packington, and I promise you, there is a solution. She looked at him, a flicker of hope returning. Can you really help me? She whispered, almost as if afraid to ask. Certainly, my dear lady, Mr. Pine said firmly, there is a cure, a guaranteed cure. She leaned forward, wide-eyed, desperate for the answer. What is it? Mr. Pine smiled. You will place yourself in my capable hands. The fee, of course, will be 200 guineas. 200 guineas! Mrs. Packington exclaimed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Exactly, Mr. Parker Pine replied calmly, his tone almost too casual. You can afford such a fee, Mrs. Packington. After all, you'd pay a similar sum for an operation. Happiness, just like your physical health, is of equal importance. Mrs. Packington's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. I pay you, afterwards, I suppose? She asked, trying to make sense of it all. On the contrary, Mr. Pine said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You pay me in advance. She stood up slowly, her hand instinctively clutching the back of her chair. I'm afraid I don't see my way. She trailed off, unsure how to proceed. Mr. Pine, unfazed, looked at her with a knowing glint in his eyes. To buying a pig in a poke? He asked cheerfully. Well, perhaps you're right. It is a lot of money to risk, but you see, you've got to trust me. You've got to take a chance. Those are my terms. 200 guineas, Mrs. Packington repeated, as if the price itself would make some impossible sense. Exactly. 200 guineas, he said again, nodding as though the matter were settled. A lot of money, indeed. But good morning, Mrs. Packington. Let me know if you change your mind. He extended a hand to her, his smile never fading, as though her decision was of little consequence. She left, her thoughts swirling. Mr. Pine waited until the door clicked shut before pressing a button on his desk. A stern-looking young woman with spectacles answered the call almost immediately. A file, please, Miss Lemon, and let Claude know I might need him shortly, he said with a quiet authority. A new client? Miss Lemon asked, handing him the file. "A new client indeed," Mr. Pine replied, his voice betraying the faintest hint of amusement. "At the moment, she's hesitating, but I expect she'll come back. Probably later this afternoon, about 4. Enter her in Schedule A." "Schedule A?" Miss Lemon raised an eyebrow. "Of course. It's always interesting how everyone believes their situation is unique," he mused, glancing at the file. "Worn Claude. No exotic elements this time. And tell him to keep his scent to a minimum. Better get his hair cut short as well." The clock ticked to 4:15 when Mrs. Packington returned to Mr. Pine's office, this time with purpose. She handed him a check and he accepted it with a nod. A receipt was quickly issued. "And now?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope, her fingers trembling slightly as she waited for him to reveal the next step. "Now," Mr. Pine said, his smile widening, "you will return home. By tomorrow morning, the first post will bring you the instructions. I trust you'll follow them as directed." Mrs. Packington walked out of his office in a state of nervous anticipation, the hope of a new beginning lighting a small fire in her heart. But when she returned home, it was clear something had shifted. Mr. Packington, for the first time in a long while, was in a defensive mood. He prepared himself for a potential confrontation, wondering if his wife would bring up the earlier scene at breakfast. But Mrs. Packington seemed different. She was unusually quiet, thoughtful even. George didn't know whether to be relieved or suspicious. As he sat listening to the radio, his thoughts drifted to Nancy, the young woman who had been at the center of his recent troubles. He toyed with the idea of buying her a fur coat. He knew she was proud, but she had mentioned the cold, and he didn't want to seem unthoughtful. A gift might be just the thing to smooth over any potential awkwardness. The tweed coat she wore was worn out after all. He smiled to himself as he imagined taking her to a fancy restaurant again. Nancy was uncommonly pretty, and George couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as the men around him seemed to envy his luck. She liked him after all. She had told him that, and to her he didn't seem a bit old. He looked up and caught his wife's eye. A strange guilt washed over him, but he quickly dismissed it. It was ridiculous, he thought. Maria was just being narrow-minded and suspicious. She was never happy for him, always begrudging him every little bit of happiness. Later that night, as George switched off the radio and prepared for bed, his mind lingered on his own secret fantasies, while his wife, on the other hand, received not one, but 3 unexpected letters the next morning. The first was from a renowned beauty specialist confirming an appointment. The second was an invitation from a prestigious dressmaker. And the third was from Mr. Parker Pine himself, requesting her company for lunch at the Ritz that very day. George, as he prepared for another business engagement, mentioned that he might not make it home for dinner. Mrs. Packington, however, didn't react with her usual sharpness. She merely nodded absently, and George felt a fleeting sense of relief. It seemed he had escaped the storm. At the beauty specialist's, Mrs. Packington was met with an enthusiastic diagnosis. "Such neglect, madam," the specialist exclaimed. "But why? This should have been taken in hand years ago. However, it's not too late." Her face was pampered, massaged, steamed, and even mud was applied. The transformation had begun. Mrs. Packington sat in front of the mirror, stunned by the transformation. The creams had been applied to her face, her skin smoothed and tightened. Powder had dusted her, giving her a flawless glow. Every finishing touch had been carefully executed. At last, they handed her the mirror. She studied her reflection, her breath catching in her throat. "I believe I do look younger," she thought to herself, feeling an unfamiliar thrill. The dress fitting had been equally exhilarating. As she stepped out, the stylish new outfit hugged her figure perfectly, making her feel smart, modish, and completely up to date. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. By 1:30, Mrs. Packington was at the Ritz, the next step in her journey. Mr. Parker Pyne, dressed immaculately as always, waited for her with an air of calm assurance. The moment he saw her, his eyes swept over her, assessing every detail with an expert's gaze. "Charming," he said, his voice low and approving. "I've taken the liberty of ordering your white lady." Mrs. Packington, who had never really been one for cocktails, hesitated slightly, but didn't object. As she sipped the drink cautiously, the exciting fluid sliding down her throat, she listened intently to her guide. "Your husband, Mrs. Packington," Mr. Pyne continued, leaning in slightly, his voice becoming more serious, "must be made to sit up. You understand? To sit up." His tone left no room for misunderstanding. "To assist in that, I'm going to introduce you to a young friend of mine. You'll lunch with him today." Before Mrs. Packington could even process his words, a young man approached, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on Mr. Pyne. With a smooth grace, he made his way toward their table. "Mrs. Packington, may I introduce you to Mr. Claude Luttrell?" Mr. Pyne announced. The man was striking, graceful, debonair, and impossibly handsome. His age was hard to guess, but he looked just shy of 30. He smiled at Mrs. Packington, his eyes twinkling with charm. "Delighted to meet you," he murmured, his voice smooth like velvet. 3 minutes later, Mrs. Packington found herself seated at a small table with Mr. Luttrell, her initial shyness melting away under his effortless conversation. He spoke of Paris, of the Riviera, and of grand adventures. "Do you enjoy dancing?" Mr. Luttrell asked with a smile. Mrs. Packington hesitated, then nodded. "I do, but it's been ages since I've had the chance. George doesn't care much for going out in the evenings." Claude Luttrell's smile widened, and he leaned in, his voice playful. "He couldn't possibly be so unkind as to keep you at home, could he?" His smile revealed a dazzling set of teeth. "Women simply won't tolerate that sort of male jealousy anymore." Mrs. Packington nearly told him that jealousy wasn't the issue, but she bit her lip and held back. After all, she thought, it's an interesting idea. Talk of nightclubs and fine dining followed, and before long it was settled. The next evening, Mrs. Packington and Mr. Luttrell would be attending the popular Lesser Archangel. Mrs. Packington felt a flutter of nervous excitement. She knew George would think it strange, perhaps even ridiculous, but she was spared the discomfort of explaining when, at 2:00, a message came through saying that George would be dining in town. That evening, at the Lesser Archangel, it was as though a new world had opened up to Mrs. Packington. She danced with Claude Luttrell, who, with his expertise, guided her through the modern steps with ease. His compliments about her gown and the stylish arrangement of her hair, done that morning at a fashionable hairdresser's, made her glow with pride. When he kissed her hand at the end of the night, it was electrifying. She hadn't felt such a rush of excitement in years. The days that followed were a blur of lunched, tea'd, tangoed, dined, danced, and supped. She was captivated by Claude's stories. His tragic childhood, the fall of his family's fortune, his bitterness toward women. Yet, through it all, his attention was all for her, and Mrs. Packington couldn't help but be swept away by his charm. On the 11th day, they were dancing again at the Red Admiral when Mrs. Packington spotted George. He was with a young lady from his office. They, too, were dancing. "Hello, George," she said lightly, when their paths crossed. Her voice was filled with amusement as she watched his face turn first red, then purple, his expression a perfect mix of astonishment and guilt. She felt a strange satisfaction, an amused sense of mastery over the situation. Poor old George, she thought, settling into her own sense of control. As she observed him, seated again at their table, she couldn't help but notice how much older he looked, how stout he was, how bald, how terribly he bounced on his feet. He danced like a man from 20 years ago, and the poor girl he was with, she looked so bored, glancing over his shoulder as though the dance were an unbearable chore. How much more enviable, Mrs. Packington thought, was her own situation. She glanced at Claude, his silence only adding to his allure. He was perfect, not a single note out of place, always in tune with her. He never jarred, unlike husbands who, after so many years, were always bound to. Their eyes met again. He smiled at her, his beautiful dark eyes full of tenderness, sadness, and a touch of longing. "Shall we dance again?" he murmured. They danced once more, the world around them fading into the background. It was heaven. Meanwhile, George's gaze from across the room burned into their every movement, a silent, apoplectic reminder of what had been and what was slipping away. Mrs. Packington's mind wandered as she stepped into the house, the rush of excitement from the evening slowly fading. She remembered her initial plan: make George jealous, spark something in him. But that was a lifetime ago, she thought. I really don't want George to feel that way now. It might upset him. But why should he be upset? Poor thing. Everyone was so happy. By the time she got home, George had been there an hour. He looked lost, almost as though he didn't recognize himself. His usual swagger had disappeared, replaced by confusion. "Humph," he muttered, not even looking up from the papers he was flipping through. "So you're back." Mrs. Packington tossed her expensive wrap onto the chair, 40 guineas for that little piece of luxury, and smiled. "Yes, I'm back." George cleared his throat awkwardly. Rather odd meeting you, wasn't it?" "Wasn't it?" she replied, her voice light, teasing. "Well, I thought it would be a kindness to take that girl somewhere," he mumbled. "She's been having a lot of trouble at home. I thought, kindness, you know. A bit of kindness." Mrs. Packington nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on George as he shuffled on his feet, fidgeting like a schoolboy caught in a lie. "Poor George," she mused, suppressing a smile. He looked so utterly pleased with himself, so obliviously transparent. His attempt to act nonchalant was almost endearing. Almost. "Who was that fellow you were with?" George blurted suddenly, his curiosity breaking through his thin facade. His tone was sharp, but laced with the insecurity he tried so hard to hide. "I don't know him, do I?" "Luttrell," she replied lightly, as if the name were of no consequence. "Claude Luttrell." "Claude Luttrell?" George echoed, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Where on earth did you meet him?" "Oh, someone introduced us," she answered vaguely, her words deliberately offering no ground for further inquiry. She was enjoying this, watching him squirm. George's face twisted in confusion, then disapproval. "Rather a queer thing for you to go out dancing at your time of life," he said, his voice adopting that infuriatingly patronizing tone. "Don't want to make a fool of yourself, my dear." Mrs. Packington smiled sweetly, though her nails dug into her palm to keep from snapping. "A change is always nice," she replied smoothly, her voice as calm as still water. But beneath her words lurked a sharp undercurrent, a warning he failed to notice. George leaned back, crossing his arms in what he must have thought was a commanding gesture. "You've got to be careful," he said, wagging a finger as though scolding a child. "A lot of these lounge lizard types hanging about. Middle-aged women," he coughed as if the words pained him, "sometimes make absolute fools of themselves. I'm just saying this for your own good." Mrs. Packington's smile grew wider, more wicked now, as her eyes glinted with suppressed amusement. "I find the exercise very beneficial," she said, her tone so syrupy sweet it could have been mistaken for sincerity. George blinked, caught off guard by her unexpected response. He fumbled for words, mumbling something incoherent, but she cut him off with a kind pat on the shoulder. "I expect you do too," she added innocently. "Exercise is so important at our age. The great thing is to be happy, isn't it? I distinctly remember you saying so the other morning, at breakfast, wasn't it?" The color drained from George's face. He stiffened, his jaw clenching, but before he could muster a retort, Mrs. Packington stretched her arms in a mock yawn, already bored of the conversation. "I think I'll head to bed now," she announced casually, turning to leave. Then, as if an afterthought, she tossed over her shoulder, "Oh, by the way, George, I've been terribly extravagant lately. Some rather large bills will be coming in. You don't mind, do you?" "Bills?" George's voice cracked, his head jerking up like a startled deer. "What kind of bills?" "Oh, you know," she said breezily, not bothering to look back. "Clothes, massages, hair treatments, all sorts of little luxuries. I've been wickedly extravagant, but I know you won't mind." She didn't wait for a response. With deliberate grace, she ascended the stairs, leaving him rooted to the spot, mouth slightly agape, his mind clearly reeling. As she reached the top of the stairs, Mrs. Packington paused, just for a moment, savoring the sweet taste of her triumph. Poor George. He'd been so oddly accommodating tonight, accepting her late nights and vague excuses with barely a protest. She smiled to herself, a smile full of satisfaction and mischief. Perhaps, she thought as she closed the bedroom door behind her, he's finally learning just how foolish it is to underestimate me. But it was strange, wasn't it? She was still Maria, his model of economy. And now I've thrown all that aside. She couldn't help but smile. But it was later, in the quiet of the night, that George's words began to surface in her mind. Lounge lizards, middle-aged women, making fools of themselves. It wasn't until the morning that they truly hit her, and suddenly a strange thought gnawed at her. Was Claude a gigolo? She had read about gigolos, of course, seen the stories in the papers. Middle-aged women falling for young men who use them for money and status. And yet, Claude wasn't really a gigolo, was he? He paid for everything, but no, Mr. Pine had paid, hadn't he? Or, well, she'd paid. Her own 200 guineas, after all. Was it all just a game, she wondered? And if it was she willing to keep playing? Mrs. Packington's mind raced, her heart pounding with confusion. Was she just another middle-aged fool? Was that all she was? And what about Claude Luttrell? Had he been laughing at her behind her back, toying with her like a silly woman? Her face flushed at the thought. She had convinced herself she was in control, that she was playing the game. But now? Now she wasn't so sure. What does it matter, she thought. Claude is a gigolo. I'm a middle-aged woman, easy prey for him. It's all a joke, isn't it? The more she thought about it, the more she felt the sting of the truth. I suppose I should have bought him something, right? A gold cigarette case, a trinket to show I was willing to pay. That's what women like me do, right? An impulse she couldn't ignore urged her out of the house. She found herself heading straight to Asprey's, the chic London store. Why not? She picked out a sleek gold cigarette case, extravagant but small enough to seem thoughtful. It felt like a token of her submission. She paid for it, and then she texted Claude, arranging to meet him at Claridge's for lunch. A ridiculous game, a ridiculous exchange. Over coffee, she pulled the case from her bag and pushed it across the table toward him. "A little present," she murmured, her voice faltering just slightly. Claude's dark eyes flickered up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "For me?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "Yes," she said, hoping to hide the discomfort she felt. "I hope you like it." Without warning, his hand shot out, slamming the cigarette case back across the table with a look of disgust. "Why do you give me that?" he hissed, his voice icy. "I won't take it. Take it back. Take it back, I say." She blinked, stunned by the sudden shift in his demeanor. He wasn't just rejecting her gift, he was rejecting her. The warmth that had filled her chest moments ago disappeared, replaced by a cold wave of shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, quickly sliding the case back into her bag. The weight of the tension between them was suffocating now. The rest of the lunch was unbearable, the conversation stiff and unremarkable. They parted with little more than a quick, awkward goodbye. The following morning, Claude called. His voice was different, urgent, and tinged with something Mrs. Packington couldn't quite place. "I must see you," he said, almost pleading. "Can I come to your house this afternoon?" She agreed, though the strange flutter of anticipation she felt was quickly replaced by a knot of dread. What was going on? This wasn't the Claude she'd known, the charming, disarming man who seemed to offer everything without effort. Now there was something darker in his eyes, something she couldn't ignore. When he arrived, his face was pale, drawn, his posture stiff. There was a strange weight in the air between them, as though everything had shifted in an instant. "What do you think I am?" he asked, his voice sharp and raw. He was pacing now, agitated. "That's what I've come to ask you. We've been friends, haven't we? But all this time, you've thought well, you think I'm just a gigolo, don't you? A creature that lives off women, a lounge lizard." "No," she said quickly, standing to meet his eyes. But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. He cut her off, his face twisting in a mixture of anger and pain. "You do think that. And you know what? It's true. I'm not some noble knight, I'm a hired hand, a man who gets paid to make women like you forget their husbands, to entertain you, to make love to you. And it's a despicable job, I know it. But that's what I've been doing, and you know what? I can't keep doing it with you." The words hit her like a slap. His intensity startled her. Was this the same Claude who had kissed her hand so delicately, who had danced with her for hours, promising a life of excitement? She took a deep breath. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I'm done," he said, stepping closer to her, his eyes fierce. "I'm through with it. I'm going to make a change. I can't live like this anymore. Not with you. You're different. You're not like the others. You're the kind of woman I could believe in, trust, adore. I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going away. I'm going to make myself into a man, a real man, instead of the loathsome creature I've been all this time, and I'll do it because of you." Before she could respond, he pulled her close, his lips crashing onto hers in a kiss that felt like an apology and a promise all at once. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled away, his face a mixture of regret and resolve. "Goodbye," he said softly, his voice trembling just enough to reveal the storm beneath. "I've been a rotter, always have been, but I swear I'll make good on this. Do you remember? Once you told me you liked reading the agony columns. Well, every year, on this day, you'll find a message there from me. It'll say, 'I remember,' that I'm making good. You'll know then, just what you meant to me." He hesitated for a moment, then reached for his finger and slid off a plain gold ring. Gently, almost reverently, he placed it in her palm. "This was my mother's. I want you to have it." His eyes lingered on hers, a thousand unspoken words passing between them. Then, with a final, quiet "goodbye," He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. She stood there, frozen, the gold ring warm and impossibly heavy in her hand. Her thoughts raced, emotions clashing like thunderclouds. It wasn't just the ring. It was the weight of what it symbolized. And then he was gone, leaving her in stunned, profound silence. A short while later, George Packington came home earlier than expected. Maria was still by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, her gaze distant and unreadable. She didn't even turn when she heard the door open. "Maria," George began suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. About that girl." "Yes, dear," she replied absently, her tone so light it felt almost indifferent. But she already knew what he was going to say. I never meant to upset you," George stammered, fumbling over his words like a schoolboy caught in a lie. There's nothing in it, really. She means nothing." Maria finally looked up, her expression calm, even serene. A faint, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "I know," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I was foolish. See as much of her as you like if it makes you happy." She waited for relief to wash over his face, for the tension to leave his shoulders. But instead, George looked annoyed. His discomfort was written all over him. A man who'd suddenly found himself trapped in a game he no longer wanted to play. Maria's satisfaction was quiet but immense. She had played her cards well, and now the game was hers. George Packington fidgeted, his thoughts unraveling as he stared blankly at the window. His stomach churned with unease, and for the first time he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The thrill he'd felt, his little fantasy of being a bold, carefree man, had vanished like smoke in the wind. Instead, a cold guilt clawed at him. What was I thinking? He wondered bitterly. How could I enjoy this? How could I take a girl about when she practically pushed me into it? The idea had seemed so deliciously daring, so exciting. But now the illusion had shattered. His shoulders sagged as he let out a deep, weary sigh. He felt tired, empty, and poorer, both in spirit and in wallet, than he had anticipated. That girl had been sharp, far sharper than him. She'd played the game perfectly, and he had been the fool. "Maria," he said at last, his voice tentative, almost pleading, "what if we went away for a bit? Just the two of us? A little break, maybe the Riviera?" Maria tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the cracks in his armor, the guilt gnawing at him like a hungry dog, and for the first time in years she felt like she had the upper hand. She smiled, soft, enigmatic, and entirely her own. "That sounds lovely, George," she said, her voice dripping with subtle triumph. "Absolutely lovely." Maria glanced up at him, offering a smile that felt more like a patronizing nod. "Oh, George, never mind about me. I'm quite happy," she said softly, but her tone carried a strange weight, an undercurrent of resignation. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't fooled either. "But I want to take you away," he insisted, his voice weak. "We could go somewhere nice, together." Maria's smile softened even more, though there was a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. Poor old George, she thought. He was so wrapped up in his own delusions. She had no intention of bursting his bubble, not now. He wasn't a terrible man, just a pathetic one. "That would be lovely, my dear," she said, her words gentle but distant. She wasn't angry. She just didn't care enough to fight anymore. The secret splendor of her life was hers alone. He would never truly understand. Meanwhile, in Mr. Parker Pine's office, another drama was unfolding. Mr. Pine, ever the unflappable businessman, was speaking with Miss Lemon, reviewing the details of their latest operation. "Entertainment account?" Mr. Pine asked, his voice calm. £102, 14 and sixpence, Miss Lemon replied crisply. As she spoke, the door opened with a soft creak, and Claude Luttrell stepped in. He looked disheveled, a frown etched deep on his face, the light of his usual charm absent. "Morning, Claude," Mr. Pine greeted him, unfazed. "Everything go off satisfactorily?" "I suppose so," Claude muttered, his mood clouded. Mr. Pine raised an eyebrow. "The ring? What name did you put on it, by the way?" "Matilda," Claude answered gloomily. 1899. "Excellent," Mr. Pine replied, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "And what wording for the advertisement?" "Making good, still remember. Claude." Claude's voice had lost all its usual flair, replaced by something darker. The weight of what he had done hung heavy in the air. "Make a note of that, Miss Lemon," Mr. Pine said, completely detached. "The agony column. November 3rd for, let me see, expenses, £102, 14 and 6. Yes, for 10 years. That leaves us a profit of £92, 2 and 4 pence. Adequate, quite adequate." Miss Lemon nodded and left the room, but Claude was still simmering. He couldn't hold it in any longer. "Look here," Claude burst out, his voice rising, his frustration raw and unfiltered. "I don't like this. It's a rotten game." Mr. Pine didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses with his signature calm, like a judge prepared to deliver a verdict. "My dear boy," he said, his tone smooth as silk, yet carrying the faintest edge of condescension. "I do not recall your conscience ever troubling you during your rather, colorful escapades. Need I remind you of your Riviera days? Those were quite the spectacle. And your dalliance with Mrs. Hattie West, wife of the Californian Cucumber King? Particularly brazen. A masterpiece of mercenary instinct, if I may say so." Claude's face flushed crimson, shame and indignation warring within him. "That's different," he muttered, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. "I never heard anyone like this. Mrs. Packington, she's a decent woman, good-hearted, and I had to lie to her. Spin her some sob story about my so-called tragic life. All for what? To make her happy? It's sick, twisted." Mr. Pine leaned back, steepling his fingers as though Claude's outburst were nothing more than an amusing diversion. Claude, my dear boy," he began, his voice dripping with patronizing patience. "You must learn to look beyond your narrow perception of morality. What you call lying, I call artistry. You didn't harm Mrs. Packington. On the contrary, you gave her precisely what she needed, an escape, a fleeting moment of joy. You gave her a romance." Claude's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. A romance? By feeding her lies? That's supposed to be some kind of gift? Mr. Pine smiled faintly, a glimmer of triumph in his sharp eyes. "Ah, but a romance, my boy, is not like a passion. Passions burn hot and fast, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. But a romance, that she can treasure. She can lay it away, wrapped in the lavender-scented folds of memory, and revisit it whenever she pleases. It becomes a keepsake, a source of comfort in a life that may otherwise lack such brightness." Claude stared at him, his chest rising and falling as if he'd just run a race. The words churned in his mind, clashing with his growing sense of guilt. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but something about Mr. Pine's logic gnawed at him. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Claude spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You think you're some kind of saint, playing God with people's lives. Not a saint, Claude," Mr. Pine replied smoothly, his smile unshaken. "Merely a realist." We've completed our commission splendidly. Mrs. Packington is happier now than she has been in years, and you played an integral role in that transformation. Whether you like it or not, you were her knight in shining armor, if only for a brief moment." Claude turned away, disgust roiling in his gut. He wanted to leave, to slam the door on this entire sordid affair, but something held him there, rooted in place. "I still don't like it," he muttered, his voice quieter now, tinged with a note of resignation. "Ah, well," Mr. Pine said, unfazed. "Perhaps you'll grow accustomed to it, or perhaps not. Consciences are tricky things, particularly when they begin to awaken in a hardened lounge lizard." Claude shot him one last look, his expression a mix of defiance and something deeper, something close to shame. Without another word, he stormed out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. As the door clicked shut, Mr. Pine leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. He picked up his pen and began to jot down a note, his handwriting precise and deliberate. "Interesting emergence of conscience and subject. Noteworthy development for further observation. Hypothesis. Romantic heroism latent in even the most cynical souls." He capped his pen, folded his hands, and stared out the window, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. Outside, Claude lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the taste bitter in his mouth. The streets were busy, bustling with life, but he felt oddly disconnected, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. He thought of Mrs. Packington, her kind eyes, her quiet strength, and for the first time, he wondered if perhaps the greatest gift he could have given her wasn't a fabricated romance, but the truth. He flicked the cigarette into the gutter, the ember fizzling out in the cold. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a chance to be more than a pawn in someone else's game. And as he walked into the crowd, his figure fading into the throng, Mr. Pine's words lingered in the air like smoke. "A romance she can keep." The task ahead for Hercule Poirot felt strikingly similar to a political minefield, cleaning up a mess of corruption and scandal, though in the world of politics, nothing is ever simple. Sir George Conway's words fell from his lips, heavy with the weight of national responsibility. "The situation is an extremely delicate one, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. Poirot couldn't help but suppress a slight smile, but instead of speaking his mind, he leaned back and put on the expression of a man prepared for the long haul, a model of politeness and restraint, like a doctor readying himself for a particularly complicated diagnosis. The pompous rhetoric continued, with Conway speaking in abstract terms about the delicacy of the government's position, the interests of the public, and the power of the press. It all sounded so polished, yet so devoid of meaning. Poirot's patience wore thin, and he could feel the all-too-familiar tug of a yawn threatening to escape. He had endured similar speeches before, particularly in the halls of Parliament, where the sound of words often served more to obscure than to enlighten. But it wasn't long before another voice, sharp and direct, cut through the monotony. Edward Ferrier, the Prime Minister, cleared his throat and decided it was time to reveal the truth. "All right, George, I'll take it from here," Ferrier said with quiet authority, his calm demeanor masking the gravity of the situation. Poirot turned his gaze toward Ferrier, feeling an immediate sense of intrigue. He had heard whispers about Ferrier from Professor MacLeod, a man Poirot trusted implicitly, and the words "sound man" rang in his ears like a high compliment. In the world of politics, sound was as rare a quality as it was vital. The Prime Minister spoke again, this time with an air of discomfort. "Monsieur Poirot, are you familiar with a publication called the X-Ray News?" he asked. Poirot, caught off guard, admitted, "I have glanced at it." Ferrier's lips tightened as he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Then you are aware of what it's about. Sensational gossip, half-truths, and hints at scandal. Some harmless, some outright dangerous, but all served with a side of spice." Poirot nodded slowly, fully aware of the nature of such publications. He had seen this type of sensationalism before. Ferrier paused, his voice shifting, growing colder and more serious. "But in the past 2 weeks, something has changed," he said. "There have been whispers about impending disclosures, revelations of corruption at the highest levels of government. And this time, Poirot, it's not just a common trick. These revelations will not disappoint." There was a dangerous edge to Ferrier's words, one that sent a ripple of tension through the room. The task ahead for Hercule Poirot felt strikingly similar to a political minefield, cleaning up a mess of corruption and scandal, though in the world of politics, nothing is ever simple. Sir George Conway's words fell from his lips, heavy with the weight of national responsibility. "The situation is an extremely delicate one, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. Poirot couldn't help but suppress a slight smile, but instead of speaking his mind, he leaned back and put on the expression of a man prepared for the long haul, a model of politeness and restraint, like a doctor readying himself for a particularly complicated diagnosis. The pompous rhetoric continued, with Conway speaking in abstract terms about the delicacy of the government's position, the interests of the public, and the power of the press. It all sounded so polished, yet so devoid of meaning. Poirot's patience wore thin, and he could feel the all-too-familiar tug of a yawn threatening to escape. He had endured similar speeches before, particularly in the halls of Parliament, where the sound of words often served more to obscure than to enlighten. But it wasn't long before another voice, sharp and direct, cut through the monotony. Edward Ferrier, the Prime Minister, cleared his throat and decided it was time to reveal the truth. "All right, George, I'll take it from here," Ferrier said with quiet authority, his calm demeanor masking the gravity of the situation. Poirot turned his gaze toward Ferrier, feeling an immediate sense of intrigue. He had heard whispers about Ferrier from Professor MacLeod, a man Poirot trusted implicitly, and the words "sound man" rang in his ears like a high compliment. In the world of politics, sound was as rare a quality as it was vital. The Prime Minister spoke again, this time with an air of discomfort. "Monsieur Poirot, are you familiar with a publication called the X-Ray News?" he asked. Poirot, caught off guard, admitted, "I have glanced at it." Ferrier's lips tightened as he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Then you are aware of what it's about. Sensational gossip, half-truths, and hints at scandal. Some harmless, some outright dangerous, but all served with a side of spice." Poirot nodded slowly, fully aware of the nature of such publications. He had seen this type of sensationalism before. Ferrier paused, his voice shifting, growing colder and more serious. "But in the past 2 weeks, something has changed," he said. "There have been whispers about impending disclosures, revelations of corruption at the highest levels of government. And this time, Poirot, it's not just a common trick. These revelations will not disappoint." There was a dangerous edge to Ferrier's words, one that sent a ripple of tension through the room. Poirot, ever the master of discretion, studied the Prime Minister's face with keen interest. "You are sure, Monsieur Ferrier?" he asked, his voice soft, yet sharp as a razor. "Because once the press gets wind of a story like this, it's rarely the facts that come to light." Ferrier gave a tight smile, though his eyes were hard. "I assure you, Poirot," he replied, "these are not your average scandalous rumors. These, will shake the very foundation of our government." Poirot felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just another case of sensationalist exaggeration. It was something real, something dangerous. And in that moment, Hercule Poirot knew that he would need all his wits to navigate this political web. The stakes had never been higher. Hercule Poirot leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Edward Ferrier, his voice calm but probing. "You know, then, what these revelations are going to be?" Ferrier hesitated for a brief moment, his brow furrowed in thought, before he spoke with calculated precision. "With a fair amount of accuracy," he said. He then began outlining the story, carefully and methodically, as if measuring each word for impact. The tale he weaved was far from edifying. It was a web of lies and deceit, accusations of the highest order, shameless chicanery, underhanded share-juggling, and a gross misuse of party funds. And at the center of it all stood the late Prime Minister, John Hammett. Ferrier's voice faltered only briefly as he described how the accusations painted Hammett not as a leader of integrity, but as a dishonorable rascal, a master of deception, a man who had used his position for his own gain, amassing a vast private fortune while betraying the very people who trusted him. Sir George Conway could hardly contain himself. He groaned, his face turning crimson. "It's monstrous, monstrous," he spluttered. "This fellow Perry, who edits the rag, ought to be shot." His anger was palpable, his fists clenched on the table. Poirot, ever the calm observer, maintained his composure. "These so-called revelations, are they to appear in the X-ray news?" he asked, his voice even, though a flicker of concern crossed his mind. "Yes," Ferrier confirmed, his tone heavy with resignation. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the gravity of the situation. "What steps do you propose to take about them?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, waiting for Ferrier's response. Ferrier hesitated, then answered slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. "They constitute a private attack on John Hammett. It is open to him to sue the paper for libel." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Will he do that?" "No," Ferrier replied, his voice grim. "It's probable that there's nothing the X-ray news would like better than for him to do so. The publicity would be enormous. Their defense would be that the statements are fair comment, and they would claim that everything printed is true. The entire sordid affair would be laid bare, exposed to the world under the harsh light of scrutiny." "Still," Poirot pressed, "if the case went against them, the damages could be catastrophic." Ferrier's expression darkened. "It might not go against them," he said, his voice low. "Why?" Poirot asked, his curiosity piqued. Sir George, too, was eager to interject, but Ferrier, already on edge, cut him off. "Because," Ferrier said, his words carrying the weight of inevitability, "what they intend to print is the truth." The room seemed to fall into a stunned silence. A deep, audible groan came from Sir George Conway, who was clearly shaken by the harsh truth laid before him. "Edward, my dear fellow, we don't admit, surely—" His voice trailed off in disbelief. A faint, almost ironic smile flickered across Ferrier's tired face. "Unfortunately, George, sometimes the stark truth has to be told. And this is one of those times." Sir George, now visibly distressed, leaned forward, his face flushed with indignation. "You understand, Monsieur Poirot, all this is strictly in confidence. Not a word, not one word, of this can be spoken to anyone outside this room." Ferrier's gaze was unflinching. "Monsieur Poirot understands that," he said, his voice resolute. But then his tone shifted, becoming even more somber. "What he may not understand, though, is this. The entire future of the People's Party is at stake. John Hammett was the very symbol of the party. He was what we stood for, a man who embodied decency, honesty, and the ideals of the people. No one ever claimed we were brilliant. We muddled through, but we always stood for doing our best, and we stood above all for fundamental honesty. Poirot's sharp eyes never left Ferrier as he continued, his voice filled with both regret and determination. And now, this is our disaster. The man who was our figurehead, the one we trusted above all else as the honest man of the people, turns out to have been one of the worst crooks of this generation. Another groan escaped Sir George, who was clearly in turmoil. Poirot, never one to show emotion, remained calm as ever. "You knew nothing of all this?" he asked, his tone gentle but penetrating. For a brief moment, Ferrier's weary eyes seemed to soften, and a ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "You may not believe me, Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly, "but like everyone else, I was completely deceived. I never understood my wife's peculiar attitude of reserve toward her father. But now I do. She knew him in a way I never could." The weight of Ferrier's words hung heavy in the air. The truth, once buried beneath layers of political rhetoric and public adoration, had been revealed at last. And with it came the realization that no matter how carefully they had constructed their world of appearances, sometimes the darkest truths would surface in the most unexpected ways. Edward Ferrier paused, his hands clasped tightly before him, his eyes haunted by the enormity of the situation. "When the truth began to leak out," he said at last, his voice shaking with the weight of what was to come, "I was horrified, incredulous. We were blindsided. We had no choice but to demand my father-in-law's resignation on the grounds of ill health." He exhaled sharply, as though trying to push away the memory. "And then we set to work, trying to clean up this mess, if you can even call it that." Sir George Conway groaned in disbelief. "The Augean stables. What a mess, what a disaster." Ferrier's expression grew even grimmer as he nodded, his tone now heavy with the dread of what lay ahead. "It will prove, I fear, to be too Herculean a task for us, George. Once the facts become public, once they flood the streets and airwaves, there will be a tidal wave of reaction, sweeping across the country. The government will fall like a house of cards, and when that happens, there will be a general election, and in all probability Everhard and his party will be returned to power. You know Everhard's policies." Sir George spluttered in disgust, his face twisting with disdain. "A firebrand, a complete firebrand. The man is reckless, a danger to the nation." Ferrier did not flinch, though his voice grew more measured, almost sorrowful. "Everhard may be reckless, but he has undeniable ability. Unfortunately, that ability is tempered with belligerence and utter tactlessness. His supporters—" He paused, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "They are inept, disorganized, and constantly wavering. It would be nothing short of a dictatorship." Poirot, who had been silently listening, nodded thoughtfully. "A situation that could unravel swiftly," he said, his voice calm, yet every word precise. Sir George, unable to contain himself, mumbled, "If only we could hush it all up, just silence the noise, bury the truth." Ferrier's face, already lined with exhaustion, showed the unmistakable signs of defeat. Slowly, he shook his head. "It can't be hushed up," he murmured. "Too many people know. It's out there, spreading like wildfire. It's too big to suppress." Poirot looked at him, his sharp gaze narrowing. "So, you believe that all hope is lost?" "I called upon you, Monsieur Poirot," Ferrier replied, his voice low but full of conviction, "because I knew you might be the only one who could see beyond the conventional, the only one who could offer a solution where all others fail." He paused, his voice growing heavier with the weight of his confession. The only options left are extreme, force or bribery. But neither can succeed. We need something drastic. The Home Secretary, in his frustration, compared our troubles to the task of cleaning the Augean stables. The truth, Monsieur Poirot, is that it will require the power of a raging river, a flood of disruption, and something so extraordinary that only a miracle can save us. Poirot's face remained impassive, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "A miracle, you say?" he asked, his voice laced with irony. "It needs, in fact, a Hercules," he added, leaning forward slightly, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "And, monsieur, you must remember, my name is Hercule." Ferrier, taken aback for just a moment, let out a short, dry laugh. "Can you perform miracles, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. Poirot's gaze remained steady, his expression almost serene. "Is that not why you sent for me? Because you thought that perhaps, just perhaps, I might be the one to find a way?" Ferrier considered this for a long moment, his gaze softening. "It's true," he admitted slowly. "I realize that if any salvation is to be achieved, it can only come through something fantastic, something completely unorthodox, a solution no one else would dare even entertain." He hesitated, as though wrestling with the enormity of the choice before him. "But perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you see this situation through an ethical lens? John Hammett was a crook. The legend of John Hammett must be shattered. The question remains, can one truly build an honest house on dishonest foundations? I don't know, but I want to try." He gave a bitter, almost sardonic smile. The politician, it seems, always wants to remain in office, but, as ever, it's for the highest of motives. Hercule Poirot rose from his seat, his figure exuding calm confidence as he faced Ferrier. "Monsieur," he said slowly, "my time in the police force has not, I admit, left me with a very high opinion of politicians. If John Hammett were still in power, I would not lift a finger. No, not even the smallest one." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "But," he continued, his voice tinged with a note of respect, "I know something about you. I have been told, by a man whose brilliance is unmatched, that you are a sound man. I will do what I can." With that, he gave a respectful bow and turned to leave the room. Sir George, still fuming with indignation, could barely contain himself. "Well, of all the damned cheek," he muttered, but Ferrier, ever the diplomat, smiled faintly and nodded. "It was a compliment," he said softly, almost to himself. As Poirot descended the stairs, a tall, fair-haired woman intercepted him. Her presence was commanding, her poise unmistakable. "Please, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her voice a perfect balance of warmth and urgency. "Come into my sitting room." Poirot, intrigued, followed her into the room. She closed the door with a soft click and gestured to an armchair. "Please," she said, offering him a cigarette before settling down opposite him. Her eyes met his with a directness that left no room for evasion. "You have just seen my husband," she began, her voice quiet but strong, "and he has told you about my father." Poirot regarded her carefully. He saw before him a tall, graceful woman, still possessing a striking beauty, with a face that radiated intelligence and resolve. Mrs. Ferrier was a figure of strength, someone who commanded respect. As the wife of the Prime Minister, she was a figure in the limelight, but even more so as the daughter of John Hammett. Dagmar Ferrier was the embodiment of the ideal Englishwoman, a devoted wife, a doting mother, someone who embraced the country life with grace. She was deeply involved in charities, leading initiatives for the wives of unemployed men, and becoming a respected figure throughout the nation. As the wife of the Prime Minister, she'd been a valuable asset to the party. But now, as the daughter of a man whose deceit was about to become public knowledge, her world would be irrevocably altered. Hercule Poirot observed Mrs. Ferrier closely, his expression softening with sympathy. "You must be terribly worried, madame," he said gently, his voice a quiet murmur of understanding. She looked at him, the weight of her worries pressing down on her as though 1,000 unseen hands were crushing her. "Oh, I am. More than you can imagine," she replied, her voice trembling with a rawness that spoke volumes. "For years, I've been dreading something. I didn't know what, but I knew something would happen, something terrible." Her eyes lowered as if afraid to face the truth that had finally caught up with her. Poirot's voice remained calm, though his gaze never left hers. "You had no idea of what was truly going on, madame?" he asked, probing gently but with careful precision. She shook her head, her shoulders slumping under the invisible weight of her own despair. "No, not in the least," she confessed bitterly. "I only knew that my father wasn't. Well, he wasn't what everyone thought him to be. Even as a child, I could see that he was a humbug." Her words were sharp, as though she were cutting through years of carefully maintained illusions. "But Edward, my poor Edward, he will lose everything because of me, because of who my father was." Poirot took a deep breath, his mind already calculating the hidden forces at play. "Have you any enemies, madame?" he asked, his voice steady, though a certain edge lingered in his words. She looked at him, surprised by the question, but her eyes quickly narrowed as she considered it. "Enemies," she echoed, the word foreign on her tongue. "I don't think so." She paused, then added more to herself than to Poirot. "But maybe I do." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "I think you do," he said, his voice lowering, its calmness belying the gravity of his words. "There is a great campaign afoot, against your husband, against you. You must prepare yourself, madame, defend yourself." Her lips parted as though to protest, but then she stopped, realizing the truth in his words. "But it doesn't matter about me," she said desperately. "It's Edward, only Edward. If anything happens to him—" "The one includes the other," Poirot interrupted, his voice firm, yet gentle. "Remember, madame, you are Caesar's wife." The words hit her like a wave, and she visibly paled. Her hand gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white as she leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What is it you're trying to tell me, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper, but laden with urgency. Meanwhile, across town, Percy Perry, editor of the X-Ray News, sat in his office. A small, weasel-like man with eyes that darted around the room like a predator seeking its next meal. He sat behind a cluttered desk, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he spoke in a soft, oily voice, relishing every word. "We'll give him the dirt all right. Lovely, lovely. Oh boy, this is going to be delicious." His second in command, a lanky youth with thick spectacles, looked uneasy, his voice laced with hesitation. "You're not nervous, are you? I mean, expecting strong-arm tactics from them? Will they try something?" Perry's eyes glinted with a smug confidence as he waved off the concern. "Nervous? Not them," he sneered. "They haven't got the nerve. Besides, it wouldn't do them any good. Not the way we've got it farmed out. This story's spread out across this country, across the continent, and even America." The young man glanced around nervously. "They must be in a pretty good stew. You don't think they'll just give up, do you? They'll try something, surely." Perry smirked. "They'll send someone to talk pretty, to try and make it all go away. But we've got this locked down tight, boy. No one's stopping this now." Just then, A buzzer sounded from the intercom. Perry reached over and picked up the receiver. "Who's that?" "Right, send him up." With a sly grin, he set the receiver down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Well, well, well. They've sent that high-toned Belgian detective to try and do his thing. He wants to know if we'll play ball with him. He chuckled to himself as the sound of footsteps approached. Moments later, Hercule Poirot entered the room, his impeccable suit and white camellia in his lapel a sharp contrast to the disarray surrounding him. He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he stood and who he was dealing with. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Perry said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Pleased to meet you. On your way to the royal enclosure at Ascot?" "No? My mistake." His eyes flicked over Poirot's attire, an attempt to belittle, but Poirot's calm smile was unbothered. "I am flattered," Poirot replied, his voice smooth. "One hopes to present a good appearance, as it is even more important," he added, casting a seemingly innocent glance at Perry's disheveled office and attire, when one has few natural advantages. Perry's face darkened slightly, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What do you want to see me about?" he asked curtly, trying to steer the conversation to business. Poirot leaned forward, his demeanor calm but his words sharp. He tapped Perry's knee with a finger, his smile widening. "Blackmail," he said, his voice brimming with amusement. Perry's face froze, his earlier swagger faltering for just a second. "What the devil do you mean, blackmail?" he spat, clearly caught off guard. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Perry's face. "I have heard," he said, his tone casual. "The little bird has told me that on several occasions you've been on the verge of publishing certain very damaging statements in your little spiritual paper. Until, of course, a pleasant increase in your bank balance arrives and suddenly those statements never see the light of day." He sat back, nodding slowly as if the matter were already settled in his mind. Perry's face flushed a shade of red as he stammered. "Do you realize that what you're suggesting amounts to slander?" Poirot's smile remained, unfazed. "I am sure you will not take offense," he said, his voice laced with dry amusement. Perry's temper snapped. "I do take offense, and as for blackmail, there's no evidence of my ever having blackmailed anyone." Poirot raised a hand in a placating gesture. No, I am quite sure of that. You misunderstand me, Monsieur Perry. I was not threatening you. I was merely leading up to a simple question." He leaned in closer, his voice a soft whisper. "How much?" Perry blinked, clearly bewildered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to regain his composure. Poirot's eyes twinkled. "A matter of national importance, Monsieur Perry," he said with quiet significance, his gaze never leaving the editor's. The two men exchanged a long, charged glance, and Perry's face tightened. He cleared his throat before speaking again. "I'm a reformer, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice gaining some measure of his previous bravado. "I want to see politics cleaned up. I'm opposed to corruption." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Do you know what the state of politics is in this country? It's like the Augean stables, no more, no less." "Tiens," Hercule Poirot exclaimed with surprise. "You, too, use that phrase." His eyes glinted with a knowing amusement as he looked at Percy Perry, who was busily waxing eloquent about the state of the world. "Indeed, it is the only solution," Perry continued, leaning forward with dramatic flair. "What's needed to cleanse these Augean stables is the great purifying flood of public opinion. That's what will wash away the rot and corruption choking this country. It's the only way forward." Poirot rose from his seat slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "I applaud your sentiments, Monsieur Perry," he said in a tone that could have been mistaken for sincere admiration. "It is a pity, however, that you do not feel in need of money." His words lingered in the air, sharp and pointed. Perry's face flushed, his eyes darting nervously as he fumbled for an explanation. "Wait a sec. Now, I didn't exactly say that." But Poirot was already making his way toward the door, his steps deliberate and unhurried. "A most interesting conversation, Monsieur Perry. But alas, I must be off." In the busy offices of the branch, Hercule Poirot met with the ever-optimistic Everett Dashwood, a young man who always seemed to radiate an unflappable cheer. "There's dirt and dirt, my boy," Dashwood said with a wink as he clapped Poirot affectionately on the back. "But my dirt's clean dirt, that's all." Poirot chuckled, though his smile was faint. "I was not suggesting that you were on a par with Percy Perry, Monsieur Dashwood." "That damn little bloodsucker?" Dashwood sneered, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "He's a blot on our profession. If we could, we'd all take him down. He's nothing but a parasite." Poirot shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "It happens," he said quietly, "that I am engaged at the moment in a little matter of clearing up a political scandal." Dashwood leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Cleaning out the Augean stables, eh?" "Too much for you, my boy. The only hope is to divert the Thames and wash away the Houses of Parliament." "You are cynical," Poirot remarked, his eyes twinkling. "I know the world, that's all." Poirot's gaze became steely. "You, I think, are just the man I seek. You have a reckless disposition, you are a good sport, and you like something that is out of the usual." Dashwood raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And granting all that?" Poirot smiled, the corners of his lips lifting in quiet confidence. "I have a little scheme to put into action. If my ideas are correct, there is a sensational plot to unmask. That, my friend, shall be a scoop for your paper." Dashwood's eyes lit up, the promise of a juicy story too good to resist. "Can do," he said eagerly, already imagining the headlines. "What's the scoop?" "It will concern a scurrilous plot against a woman," Poirot said with a nod. "Better and better," Dashwood responded, grinning. "Sex stuff always goes." "Then sit down and listen carefully," Poirot said, as the plot began to take shape. The scene shifted to the Goose and Feathers in Little Wimplington, where gossip flowed as freely as the ale. "Well, I don't believe it," one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "John Hammett was always an honest man. He wasn't like some of these political folk." Another voice interrupted, skeptical. "That's what they say about all swindlers before they're found out." A third voice, full of disgust, added, "Thousands, they say, he made from that Palestine oil business. Just a crooked deal it was. Whole lot of 'em tarred with the same brush. Dirty crooks, every one of 'em," someone else chimed in. "But you wouldn't find Everhard doing that," one man protested. "He's one of the old school." "Hey, but I can't believe John Hammett was a wrong 'un," another man grumbled. "You can't believe everything the papers say." And then the conversation turned to Mrs. Ferrier. "Ferrier's wife was his daughter. Have you seen what they're saying about her?" A well-worn copy of the X-ray News passed from hand to hand. The headline read, "Caesar's wife." A certain highly placed political lady was seen in very strange surroundings the other day, complete with her gigolo. The whispers grew louder. "Oh, Dagmar, Dagmar, how could you be so naughty?" one woman said, a hint of scandal in her voice. A man spoke up slowly, his voice low. "Mrs. Ferrier's not that kind. A gigolo. That's one of those Dago skunks, isn't it?" Another voice, filled with bitterness, said, "You never can tell with women." The whole bunch of 'em's wrong uns if you ask me." Meanwhile, in the Ferrier household, Edward Ferrier was beside himself with rage, his face pale with frustration. "These attacks on my wife, scurrilous, absolutely scurrilous," he thundered at Hercule Poirot. "I'm bringing an action against that vile rag. They can't just print lies like this." Poirot looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I do not advise you to do so, Monsieur Ferrier. But these damned lies have got to be stopped." Ferrier spat, pacing the room. "This is a matter of honor." Poirot's voice was calm but firm. "Are you sure they are lies?" Ferrier stopped in his tracks, his face flushing with fury. "God damn you, yes!" he snapped. Poirot's eyes softened ever so slightly as he asked, "What does your wife say?" For a brief moment Ferrier was silent, caught off guard. "She says it is best to take no notice," he muttered, his voice faltering. "But I can't do that. Everyone is talking." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, everyone is talking." And then, in a swift move, the news hit the papers. A small but ominous announcement appeared in every newspaper. "Mrs. Ferrier has had a slight nervous breakdown. She has gone to Scotland to recuperate." But the rumors didn't stop there. Whispers spread like wildfire, each more scandalous than the last. People began to say Mrs. Ferrier wasn't in Scotland at all. In fact, she had been seen in Paris, with a dark, handsome Argentine gigolo named Ramon, drugged or drunk, her behavior a far cry from the dignified woman everyone had once known. The X-ray News dug deep, publishing scandalous photos of Mrs. Ferrier in nightclubs, draped around the shoulder of a vicious-looking young man. Another snapshot showed her lounging on a beach, her arm casually resting over the shoulder of another man. The headline, "Mrs. Ferrier has a good time." 2 days later, a libel suit was filed against the X-ray News. The prosecution was led by Sir Mortimer Inglewood, K.C., who entered the courtroom with righteous indignation, ready to battle for justice. The stage was set. The story was far from over. The courtroom was charged with an electric atmosphere as Sir Mortimer Inglewood rose to his feet, his voice ringing with indignation. He had a solemn expression on his face as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mrs. Ferrier is the victim of a vile and malicious plot, one worthy of comparison only to the infamous Queen's Necklace affair, a scandal meant to tarnish the reputation of a noble woman, just as that plot sought to bring down Marie Antoinette herself." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a ripple of intrigue running through the audience. "This conspiracy," Sir Mortimer continued, "was designed to undermine a woman of virtue, someone held in the highest regard by this country, much like Caesar's wife, above reproach." His eyes swept over the jury, daring them to doubt his words. The air was thick with anticipation as he began to call his witnesses. The first was the Bishop of Northumbria, Dr. Henderson, a man known throughout the land for his saintliness, integrity, and unyielding virtue. When he stepped into the witness box, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I swear," the bishop began in his calm, measured voice, "that between the dates in question, Mrs. Edward Ferrier was staying at the palace with my wife and myself. She had been worn out by her tireless work with charity and good deeds. Her visit was kept secret to protect her from the prying eyes of the press." The next witness, an eminent doctor, corroborated the bishop's testimony, speaking of his orders for Mrs. Ferrier to take rest and completely avoid stress. Another local physician confirmed that he had attended to her at the palace. But then came a name that caught everyone's attention: Thelma Anderson. A hush fell over the courtroom as she entered the witness stand. A woman of striking resemblance to Mrs. Ferrier, she carried herself with an air of mystery. Eyes were fixed on her as she took her place. "Your name is Thelma Anderson?" the prosecutor asked, his voice sharp. "Yes," she replied coolly. "You are Danish?" "Yes, from Copenhagen." "And you worked at a cafe in Copenhagen?" "Yes, I did," she said, her gaze steady as she recounted the events of that fateful day. "Please tell us," the prosecutor urged, "what happened on the 18th of March." Thelma took a deep breath and began. "There is a man who used to come to my table at the cafe, an English gentleman. He told me he worked for an English paper, the X-Ray News." The room seemed to lean in, everyone hanging on her every word. "Are you sure it was the X-Ray News?" the prosecutor pressed. "Yes, I am sure. At first, I thought it was a medical paper, but then he explained it was not." She paused before continuing. "He said there was an English actress who needed a stand-in, someone who resembled her in public appearances. He said I was the perfect type for the job." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The mystery was deepening. "How much money did he offer you?" the prosecutor asked, his voice rising with anticipation. £500, she replied. "At first, I thought it was some trick, but then he gave me half the money up front. So I quit my job and agreed." The tension in the courtroom mounted as Thelma described her journey to Paris, the new clothes she received, and the escort provided for her. An Argentine gentleman, described as polite and respectful. "A very nice gentleman," she said, her voice softening. "He took me to many places, nightclubs in Paris, some on the Riviera." The prosecutor leaned forward. "And what kind of places were these?" Thelma hesitated for a moment, then admitted, "Some were not respectable." A murmur ran through the crowd. "But Senor Ramon was always kind to me," she added quickly. "It was all for advertisement. They told me it was necessary for the publicity." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "And did you ever hear the name Mrs. Ferrier mentioned during your time with these men?" She shook her head. "Number, I didn't know who I was supposed to be standing in for. It was only later, when I saw the pictures, that I realized." With that, the prosecutor began showing the infamous photographs, Thelma in Paris, at nightclubs, and on the beach, her arm draped over the shoulder of the olive-skinned gentleman. "Do you recognize these photographs?" he asked. She nodded reluctantly. "Yes, they were taken of me in Paris and the Riviera." As she spoke, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence. The photographs, the connections, and the unsettling similarities between Thelma and Mrs. Ferrier all pointed to the same conclusion. Mrs. Ferrier had been framed, the victim of a dark conspiracy. The courtroom drama intensified, with the layers of deceit unfolding, each revelation adding weight to the growing scandal. The audience, on edge, couldn't look away as Poirot's intricate web of truth and lies began to tighten around those responsible for the attack on Mrs. Ferrier's honor. The courtroom became a battleground, not just for justice, but for the soul of a nation gripped by scandal. There was no mistaking it. Thelma Anderson had all the hallmarks of absolute honesty, but the woman was clearly naive. Pleasant, yes, but not exactly sharp. It was evident to everyone that she was genuinely distressed now that the truth had come to light. As the defense team desperately tried to spin their tale, their frantic denials rang hollow. They insisted they had no dealings with the woman, but their weak excuses fell flat in the face of mounting evidence. The photographs, they argued, had simply been delivered to their London office, and they had believed them to be genuine. But it was Sir Mortimer's closing speech that truly set the courtroom alight. His words were laced with passion, rallying the crowd and evoking a collective sense of justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he thundered, "this entire scheme was nothing less than a vile political plot, conceived to bring down not just Mrs. Ferrier, but the Prime Minister and his entire administration. We must stand by the victim of this wicked attack, Mrs. Ferrier, a woman whose honor has been irreparably harmed. The perpetrators must be made to pay." The air in the courtroom crackled with fervor, and the jury's verdict was inevitable. The room erupted in applause when the decision was announced. A staggering sum was awarded in damages, a fitting consequence for the wickedness that had been uncovered. Mrs. Ferrier, her husband, and her father left the court to the cheers and admiration of the crowd that had gathered outside. Edward Ferrier grasped Hercule Poirot's hand warmly, his face alight with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Monsieur Poirot," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "1,000 times I thank you. That filthy rag, the X-ray news, is finished, wiped out, and it serves them right for trying to destroy Dagmar, the kindest soul in the world. Thank God you were able to expose the whole scandal for what it was, a filthy ramp, nothing more." Poirot's eyes twinkled, his expression as calm as ever. "What made you suspect they were using a double?" Edward asked, still in awe of Poirot's brilliance. "Ah, but it is not a new idea," Poirot said with a small smile. "It was used in the case of Jeanne de la Motte, when she impersonated Marie Antoinette. The technique is as old as time." Edward raised an eyebrow. "I must reread the Queen's necklace. But how did you find this woman, the one they were using?" Poirot leaned back, crossing his arms with a satisfied air. "I looked for her in Denmark, naturally. Mrs. Ferrier's grandmother was Danish, and Dagmar herself has a distinctly Danish look. But there were other reasons, too." Edward's eyes widened. "Denmark? The resemblance was remarkable, that's true. But what a devilish idea! How could anyone come up with such a scheme?" Poirot chuckled softly, tapping his chest. "It wasn't them who came up with it, Edward. It was I who thought of it." Edward stared, perplexed. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" Poirot's smile deepened. "Ah, you must go further back in history than the Queen's necklace. Think of the cleansing of the Augean stables. Hercules used a river, a great force of nature. Now, modernize that. What is the great force of nature in our world today? Sex, my friend. It is sex that drives the headlines, that sells stories, that makes news. Give people a scandal tied to sex, and they'll devour it far more eagerly than any political conspiracy." Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "My task was to put my hands in the mud, just as Hercules did, and build a dam to change the course of the river. A journalistic friend of mine helped me. He searched Denmark, found the right woman, and casually mentioned the X-ray news to her. She remembered it, of course." The full realization hit Edward like a thunderbolt. "So, it was all mud, a mess of scandal. And my wife, Dagmar, was at the center of it all? You used her?" His voice was tinged with a mixture of disbelief and fury. But before Poirot could respond, the door swung open, and Mrs. Ferrier entered the room with her usual grace, a calm smile on her face. "Well," she said in her soft voice, "that went off very well." Edward blinked in utter confusion. "Dagmar, did you know about all of this?" Mrs. Ferrier gave him a sweet, serene smile. "Of course, dear, I knew from the start." Edward was stunned. "And you never told me? You never said a word?" "But, Edward, you would never have let Monsieur Poirot do it if you had known," she replied softly, her eyes twinkling with a knowing look. Edward opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot interrupted with a mischievous grin. "Indeed, Edward would never have agreed to it. That is why I had to keep the secret." Mrs. Ferrier smiled at both of them, her voice gentle. "I had a very restful time with the dear bishop. He's such a good man. I feel full of energy now. In fact, I've been invited to christen the new battleship in Liverpool next month. I think it would be a popular thing to do, don't you think?" Edward stared at her, still grappling with the revelation. The woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew, had been part of this entire grand ruse. A tide of emotions flooded him, relief, anger, admiration. But one thing was clear. Nothing in their world would ever be the same again. Imagine Hercule Poirot, the little Belgian detective, packed like sardines in the chaotic rush of London's underground. His thoughts, as always, sharply observant, dissecting the masses around him with a critical eye. The sweat, the heat, the desperate rush of bodies crammed into the same train. It's a scene that feels both claustrophobic and suffocating. But Poirot? He stands there, like a man untouched by the madness. His disdain for the masses is palpable. "There are too many people in the world," he mutters, shaking his head at the sea of unfamiliar faces. It's not just the noise and the bustle that bothers him, but the absolute lack of elegance. Why, he wonders, do women knit on the train? The absurdity of it makes him wince. A woman knitting in a crowded train is a far cry from the sophisticated, alluring femme du monde he so desperately craves. The train jerks and sways, shoving Poirot from one stranger to the next, each bump a reminder of how little grace the world seems to have left. He dreams of a time when women draped in luxury, elegant and unpredictable, would have been enough to stop time. But no, now all he sees are rushed, stressed commuters, knitting with a frantic focus, their faces void of anything remotely intriguing. It's a harsh reality check for a man who once rubbed elbows with royalty, thieves, and women whose very presence made the world seem softer, more elegant. Suddenly, the train lurches to a halt, and Poirot's life takes an unexpected twist. Out of the swarm of ordinary people, his eyes lock on something, or should I say, someone? A woman. But not just any woman, she's a vision, impossible to ignore. A striking figure of opulence, crowned with vibrant exotic feathers, and wrapped in furs that whisper of a far more glamorous world. Her voice, rich and powerful, slices through the clamor of the train station. "It is, mon cher Hercule Poirot," she cries, as if the past had come crashing back to life in the blink of an eye. And yet, the universe has a strange way of playing with timing. The two are trapped in the eternal dance of two escalators moving in opposite directions, doomed never to meet. Poirot leans forward, desperate, calling to her, but the woman, Countess Vera Rosikoff, a name Poirot once dreaded and adored in equal measure, is swept away. "In hell," she says, her voice carrying a mysterious, almost prophetic ring. Poirot is left dumbfounded, his mind racing. Hell? What could she possibly mean by that? The underground? Or is it a cryptic hint about something darker, more treacherous? His heart, long captivated by her wild allure, is once again swept into confusion. "In hell?" he repeats, almost to himself, as if searching for meaning in the absurdity. He knows she's playing a game, and he's both the pawn and the player. With no clear direction, Poirot embarks on a mission the next morning, determined to unravel the mystery. He seeks answers from the unassuming Miss Lemon, his secretary, who, though humorless and impeccably efficient, might hold the key. Her response is as blunt as it is revealing. "It's a nightclub. Hell, they call it," she says, as though she's discussing the weather. "Run by some Russian woman. You'll need a reservation." The evening arrives, and Poirot steps into the unknown. The door swings open, revealing a world of excess, where each step down the stairs brings him closer to the surreal. Neon lights flicker as he descends, each phrase on the walls both mocking and inviting. "I meant well." I can give it up any time I like. As he crosses a bridge over a tank of scarlet lilies, he feels the presence of something sinister. And there, in the shadows, sits the largest, most terrifying dog he's ever seen, an ominous guardian of this underworld. The night deepens and Poirot's curiosity is piqued. The Countess's cryptic words echo in his mind. Is this truly hell? Or is it a world much more dangerous and beguiling than he ever anticipated? As he stands there, caught between past and present, between mystery and reality, one thing is certain. Poirot is once again in the clutches of the dangerous, fascinating world that has always ensnared him. And just like that, he knows that, much like the mythical Cerberus, his journey is just beginning. Poirot stood frozen, his pulse quickening as the unthinkable seemed to materialize before him. He fought against the sickening feeling creeping up his spine, attempting to reason with himself. But the truth was undeniable. It was real. Far too real. His mind screamed for him to dismiss it, dismiss the absurdity, the madness. But the hound, that massive, monstrous creature, shifted. Its head, impossibly large and bristling with menace, turned toward him. The eyes, dark, burning embers, pierced the very air. And then came the growl, a low, thunderous rumble, as though it were emanating from the depths of the earth itself. A sound so deep, so visceral, it made the very atmosphere tremble. It was not just a threat, but a declaration, a warning, one that struck straight to the marrow of his bones. Poirot's heart skipped a beat, but he was not one to yield easily. Yet, in that moment, it was as though the entire world had paused. The very air held its breath. He didn't dare look away. The creature's gaze locked onto him with the kind of focus that sent a jolt of primal fear through even Poirot's composed mind. But it wasn't him the hound was fixated on. Poirot's eyes, drawn by some twisted instinct, followed the path of the creature's gaze. There, beside him, sat a decorative basket, its contents incongruously mundane. Small, round dog biscuits, their presence mocking the gravitas of the moment. And then, the label. The words, so simple, so utterly ridiculous in their certainty. A sop for Cerberus. The absurdity of it all, the irony, the sheer madness, was almost too much for Poirot to bear. Yet the hound didn't look away, not once. Its eyes locked onto the biscuits, burning with an insatiable hunger that threatened to consume the very soul of the room. A growl, sharper and more threatening this time, sliced through the air. The tension in the room grew thicker. Poirot could feel his pulse thudding in his ears, but his resolve remained unshaken. He was Poirot, the master of observation, the solver of impossibilities. He would not falter. Quickly, but with a precision that only he could muster, Poirot seized a biscuit from the basket and hurled it with unanticipated speed. The hound's mouth opened in a monstrous gape, a cavernous abyss that seemed to stretch beyond reason. With a single snap, the biscuit vanished into its maw. Cerberus had been silenced, for the moment. Poirot allowed himself a brief exhale, the tension in his chest finally easing. It was a small victory, but it was enough. But there was no time for triumph. Poirot's mind sharpened once more. The real challenge awaited him beyond the next door, and with purpose he stepped forward. Inside, the atmosphere hit him like a wave. Strange, unsettling, yet unmistakably magnetic. The space was small, almost claustrophobic, but pulsed with an eerie energy. In the center, a dance floor flickered under the glow of crimson lights, casting long, twisted shadows on the faded frescoes that adorned the walls. At the far end of the room, a grill blazed with an infernal intensity. Chefs, dressed as devils in black aprons, flipped skewers with such fervor it seemed as if the flames themselves were alive, hungry for more. Just as Poirot began to absorb the bizarre scene, a voice cut through the chaotic energy like a blade. High-pitched, with the kind of extravagant enthusiasm only a woman of great drama could command. "Ah, you have come, my dear, my very dear friend." The Countess Vera Rosikoff entered like a tempest, her scarlet evening gown practically glowing in the dim light, drawing all eyes to her. She radiated power, confidence, and something far more dangerous, charisma. Her arms swept wide, as if to embrace not just Poirot but the entire concept of friendship itself. "What a joy to see you again," she continued, her voice lilting with playful exaggeration. "After all these years, so many, how many? No, let's not count. To me it seems but yesterday we last met." Her presence filled the room, her energy crackling, as if the very air bent to her will. Poirot, ever the observer, took it all in, his mind already moving, calculating, piecing together the puzzle of this strange encounter. What did it all mean? And why had he, of all people, been drawn into this dizzying web of danger and intrigue? Poirot's bow was as precise as the hand of a watchmaker, each movement measured and deliberate, a man who had navigated the labyrinth of life's complexities with elegance and experience. He took her hand with the reverence of someone who had seen the world at its most wondrous and most wretched. "Nor you, chère amie," he replied, his voice a velvet thread woven with something deeper, a shadow that lingered just beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniably present. His eyes lingered on her face, tracing the years etched into her features, noting the subtle transformations that time had imposed upon her. She wasn't the young beauty he remembered, but she was undeniably striking. A ruin, yes, but a spectacular one, a testament to the kind of woman who could wear age like a crown, with all the grace of a fallen star. Before he could lose himself in the storm of memories, the Countess's voice cut through the haze, vibrant and commanding. "Come, you must meet my friends," she exclaimed, her voice like a wave crashing against the calm of the room. With a sweeping gesture, she motioned toward a nearby table where two figures sat, their presence equally curious. The first was a tall, thin, elderly man, his face the portrait of discomfort. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief as though the very air around him was too much to bear. "This is my friend, my celebrated friend, Monsieur Hercule Poirot," the Countess announced, with all the grandeur of an opera diva making a grand entrance. Her words sparkled with a drama that only she could summon, sending a ripple of curiosity through the room. "He who is the terror of evildoers. I was once afraid of him myself," she continued, her tone teasing, almost flirtatious. "But now I lead a life of the most extreme, the most virtuous dullness. Is it not so?" Poirot's lips curled into a polite but pointed smile, an amused gleam dancing in his eyes. He could never quite escape the Countess's flair for the theatrical. But the tall man, Professor Liskeard, was not so easily swayed. With an exaggerated sigh, he raised a bushy eyebrow, shaking his head as he muttered, "Never say dull, Countess." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of the world to find anything dull at all. The Countess laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm, both mocking and affectionate in equal measure. "Ah, Professor Liskeard, the man who knows everything about the past," she announced, her eyes glinting with mischief. "He gave me all the valuable hints for the decorations here." With a grand flourish, she gestured toward the bizarre frescoes that adorned the walls, each more absurd and outlandish than the last. "You see, we are all here for the extreme, the unexpected. Everything in life must be a spectacle, mustn't it?" Poirot's sharp eyes swept over the frescoes, taking in each surreal, mind-bending detail with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed distaste. The first image that caught his attention was that of Orpheus, standing confidently before a jazz band, strumming his lyre as Eurydice gazed longingly at the grill. Yes, the grill, right in the heart of the underworld, no less. Then there was Osiris and Isis, floating serenely on a boat in the afterlife, throwing a party so extravagant it could only have been conceived in the darkest corners of the imagination. And perhaps most absurdly, a scene of youthful revelers caught in a wild orgy of uninhibited chaos, caught somewhere between the madness of nature and the fleeting abandonment of sanity. Each fresco seemed to pulse with life, as though it were more than a mere painting. Each one a reflection of the Countess herself, surreal, provocative, and utterly unpredictable. The absurdity of it all was intoxicating, a chaotic masterpiece of debauchery and delight, crafted with a manic energy that made Poirot feel as if he were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than a mere social gathering. It was madness, yes, but it was also brilliant in its own twisted way. As Poirot's eyes flicked back to the Countess, he could see her standing there, delighting in the reaction her creations provoked. Her smile was as wide as a crescent moon, and her eyes glittered with the thrill of being the architect of such a spectacle. But even as he admired her audacity, Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the glittering surface of her world, something far darker and more dangerous lurked. And for once, the great detective was uncertain whether he was walking into a puzzle to be solved or a trap waiting to be sprung. "This," the Countess said, sensing his confusion, "this is the country of the young." She added, without missing a beat, "And this is my little Alice." Poirot turned to the young woman seated next to the Countess. Alice Cunningham. Her severe appearance, checkered coat, horn-rimmed glasses, and a demeanor that screamed intellectual, immediately put Poirot on edge. Alice, however, offered him a stiff smile and leaned in to speak. "I find her fascinating," Alice said, referring to the Countess, "not just as the mother of the man I intend to marry, but as a case study in psychology." "Really?" Poirot asked, intrigued. "In what sense?" Alice straightened, her voice gaining confidence. "I'm writing a book on criminal psychology. Vera's quirks, shall we say, are particularly illuminating. For instance, her obsession with stealing things. Not money, mind you, but glittering objects like jewels. She has what I call the magpie complex." Poirot was taken aback. "Indeed?" "I was unaware of this habit." Alice continued, her voice growing colder. "Oh, yes, she's always taken, but never for the reasons you might think. As a child, she was coddled, protected, shielded from the harshness of the world, yet craving the glittering things to fill that emptiness. Fascinating, isn't it?" The night was growing darker, the atmosphere more intoxicating. As the band played louder, Poirot couldn't help but wonder what he'd stumbled into. It was a world that seemed to exist outside the bounds of ordinary morality, a world where the gates of hell were not only open, they were an invitation. But before he could process it further, the Countess, catching his eye, leaned forward. "What do you think, mon cher Hercule? Is it not chic?" she asked, the implication clear. This was a world of excess, and Poirot was a guest of honor. "Very well imagined," Poirot said, his voice calm but his mind racing. "It is. Chic." And so it was. Hell, in all its decadent, intoxicating glory, had not only caught on, it had flourished. Life had become unbearably mundane for her, an endless cycle of monotony. Her very being yearned for something more, something thrilling and dangerous. Drama wasn't just a craving, it was a necessity. Beneath her sophisticated exterior lay a woman desperate for punishment, for notoriety. It was this very desire that fueled her reckless indulgence in theft. She didn't just want to take something. She wanted the thrill of being caught, of being punished. She wanted the world to know her name, to see her as the woman who dared. Poirot, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow, his mind working furiously to untangle the web of contradictions surrounding the mysterious Countess. "But surely, Miss Cunningham," he interjected, his voice smooth yet edged with disbelief, "a member of the Russian aristocracy, thrown into the chaos of the Revolution, wouldn't have led such a dull, sheltered life, would she?" The question hung in the air, as if the very notion of a dull aristocrat was absurd to Poirot's trained mind. Yet, despite his calm exterior, doubt gnawed at him. A faint glimmer of amusement danced behind Alice Cunningham's pale blue eyes, like the flicker of a candle's flame before it disappears into the dark. She regarded him with a cool detachment, her lips curling into the slightest of smirks. "Ah," she responded, her voice a silken challenge. "Did she tell you that?" Her words were like a subtle jab, carefully designed to unearth Poirot's assumptions and expose their fragile foundations. Poirot's brow furrowed, caught in the snare of his own convictions. He pressed on, undeterred. "She is undeniably an aristocrat," he declared, with a firmness that bordered on desperation, as if repeating the words might make them true. But even as he spoke, a strange unease settled over him, the Countess's shifting stories writhing like shadows, casting doubt over everything he thought he knew about her. Miss Cunningham, ever the sharp observer, only shrugged, her indifference a palpable presence. "One believes what one wishes to believe," she remarked, her tone light, but laced with a biting edge. It was as though Poirot's desperate need for certainty, a need that had served him well for years, was nothing more than a quaint little flaw to her, something to be casually dismissed. Poirot felt a pang of discomfort, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. For once, he was being outmaneuvered, and his pride couldn't help but sting. Not one to be easily rattled, Poirot quickly regained his composure, shifting the focus of the conversation as if resetting the chessboard. "But tell me, Miss Cunningham," he said, his voice now laced with challenge, "how is it that someone with such youth, such promise, doesn't make the effort to be more captivating?" His gaze sharpened, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "You dress as though preparing for a round of golf, yet here you are, surrounded by society's finest. Your lips," he added with a calculated glance, "are painted, but there's no fire in them, no passion, no effort to enhance what nature has already given you." For the briefest moment, Miss Cunningham's composure cracked. Just a flicker of something deep and raw flashed across her face. Poirot saw it, a flash of pure, unfiltered anger that she swiftly smothered beneath a mask of practiced indifference. She took a sharp breath, her eyes narrowing, and in that instant Poirot realized he had struck a nerve. With a cool, almost pitying tilt of her head, she finally spoke. "Ah, Poirot," she said, the words slipping from her lips like velvet but carrying a venomous undertone. "You're so far removed from the modern world, aren't you? You still think it's all about appearances." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "But it's not about the surface, Poirot. It's about essence." Her words were dripping with condescension, yet there was something in the detachment, the coolness of her gaze, that sent a chill down Poirot's spine. For the first time in their exchange, Poirot found himself on the defensive, his mind scrambling to catch up with her ruthless precision. Alice Cunningham was no mere distraction. She was a force, one that even the great Hercule Poirot wasn't quite prepared to face. Poirot, frustrated but trying to maintain his usual calm, studied her. Just as he was about to respond, a new figure entered the scene. A young man, dark and handsome, moving with a fluid grace across the room. Alice Cunningham's eyes lit up. "Ah, Paul Varesco," she murmured with interest. "A man with a taste for women and peculiar depraved desires. I have a feeling he'll have some fascinating stories to share." The way she spoke of him sent a chill down Poirot's spine. There was something unsettling about the way she approached these criminal types, as though she were more intrigued than repelled. As the young man glided past, Poirot caught snippets of their conversation. A strange tale of a nursery governess and a toy crane. His mind raced. What were they really talking about? And why was Alice Cunningham so fascinated by the darker side of life? Poirot's musings were interrupted by a sudden realization. The young man at the other table wasn't who he appeared to be. Behind the facade of an idle-rich playboy was a man Poirot recognized well. Detective Inspector Charles Stevens, undercover no doubt. A quiet suspicion crept into Poirot's mind. What was Stevens really up to? The following morning, Poirot paid a visit to Scotland Yard, seeking answers from his old friend, Chief Inspector Japp. Japp's response was far more open than Poirot expected. "Poirot, you sly fox, how do you always manage to get to the heart of things?" Japp chuckled, clearly impressed. But when Poirot pushed further, Japp's tone shifted. "Ah, hell," he said with a knowing look. "On the surface, it's just another hotspot for the elite, but we've got a feeling there's something darker going on. Drugs, jewels, it's all connected." Poirot listened intently, piecing together the fragments of information. The woman at the center of it all, the Russian countess, was no simple aristocrat. Behind her facade was a complex web of lies, deceit, and criminal activity. The jewels were being traded for drugs, and the players involved were not who they seemed. Poirot's mind was working at full speed. This was a case of deception at its finest. He couldn't let the women of society fall prey to this dangerous game. And at the heart of it all, Paul Varesco seemed to be the key. But Poirot knew better than anyone that things were rarely as they appeared on the surface. He needed to dig deeper, and he wasn't about to let Alice Cunningham or anyone else stand in his way. As Poirot stood, the atmosphere in the club grew heavier, and the laughter of the Countess seemed to echo through the room like a haunting reminder of the dangerous game being played. The air, thick with intrigue, made every step toward the exit feel like a decision that could change everything. Poirot turned back to the Countess, his eyes narrowing as he regarded her more closely. "You know, I must confess," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "there is something that bothers me about this whole charade. You see, I've been watching you closely." The Countess raised an eyebrow, her playful demeanor faltering just for a moment. "Mon cher, what do you mean? I have nothing to hide." "Oh, but I beg to differ," Poirot replied, his gaze hardening. "Your little story about Dudu, that's not what worries me. No, it's something far more significant. You see, I've been working my way through the pieces of this puzzle, and I've come to a conclusion I wasn't expecting." A strange silence fell over the table. The Countess, who had been laughing just moments ago, suddenly seemed distant, her playful smile fading into something darker, something that seemed almost like a mask. "You've been keeping something from me, haven't you?" Poirot continued, leaning in slightly. "This club, your partnership with Varesco, it's all a facade, isn't it? You and Varesco, you're not just running this place, you're using it for something far more sinister. Drugs, yes, but there's something more, something international." The Countess's face tightened, her eyes flickering with a mixture of defiance and fear. "You've been quite clever, Poirot," she said, her voice cold now. "But cleverness won't save you." Before Poirot could respond, there was a sudden crash from across the room. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The entire club seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows. Paul Varesco, his eyes wild, his hand clutching a gun. "Don't move!" Varesco shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You've uncovered too much, Poirot, and now you're going to regret it." The Countess, her earlier calm shattered, stood quickly, her face pale. "Paul, no!" she cried, reaching out toward him. "This wasn't part of the plan." But Poirot remained unmoved, his mind racing. In an instant, he knew what was happening. This was not about drugs, this was something much more dangerous. International smuggling, corruption, and hidden alliances that extended far beyond the club's walls. Varesco, desperate and panicked, was the final piece of the puzzle. Poirot's eyes locked onto Varesco, his voice steady despite the tension. "You made a mistake, my friend. You thought you could pull the strings, but now you've trapped yourself." Varesco's hand tightened around the gun, but he faltered. Poirot's calmness, his unwavering confidence, had unsettled him. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked from behind Varesco. Inspector Stevens, whom Poirot had quietly alerted earlier, stepped into view, his gun aimed squarely at Varesco's back. "Put it down, Varesco," Stevens commanded, his voice firm. "You're surrounded." The Countess's face went ashen. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You set us up, Poirot?" "You knew?" Poirot smiled gently, but there was a coldness to it that sent a shiver down her spine. "Ah, madame, there is always more to a puzzle than meets the eye. You were right to be cautious of me, but now the game is over." As Varesco slowly dropped the gun, Poirot stepped forward, his tone as calm as ever. "Now, I believe we shall all take a little trip, straight to Scotland Yard." Scene continues with Poirot and the Countess in the room. A faint hint of tension is in the air, the night deep and filled with secrets. Poirot, his voice calm but sharp. "Ah, Vera, my dear Countess, I must admit I am impressed. You've quite the knack for creating confusion. But you see, you have underestimated one thing. Me." Countess Rosikoff, her smile faltering slightly, her eyes betraying a flicker of hesitation. "Mon cher Hercule, you flatter me. I had no intention of confusing you. But you must understand the circumstances are complex." Poirot, raising an eyebrow. "Ah, complex, you say?" "I am inclined to disagree, my dear. Nothing about this is complex. In fact, it is quite simple. You planned to slip the emeralds into my pocket, but the lights went out, and instead they ended up in Professor Liskeard's. I am curious, though. Why the haste? Why me?" Countess Rosikoff laughs softly, almost nervously, and glances toward the window. "You always see through me, don't you, Hercule? I wanted to trust you, but the game was getting dangerous, and I had no choice but to act swiftly." Her voice dips lower, a hint of regret in her tone. "You see, these emeralds are not just stones. They are part of something far more valuable." Poirot, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ah, valuable. You speak of a treasure, perhaps. A treasure hidden in plain sight, surrounded by lies and deception. But tell me, Vera, did you ever stop to consider the consequences of your actions? What if someone had gotten wise to your little game?" Countess Rosikoff. Her face grows tense and she paces slowly, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't think it would come to this. When I first joined forces with Varesco, it was only to protect the interests of the club. But soon things got out of hand. People began to notice the missing shipments. The pressure mounted, and I needed a way to keep things in my control. She stops pacing and faces Poirot. And I trusted you, Hercule. I thought you might be the one to help me get out of this mess. Poirot. His gaze softens, but there's a note of steel in his voice. Ah, but trusting me, Vera, is not the same as deceiving me. You did not see me as your ally until you were already trapped, and only then did you scramble to cover your tracks. What makes you think I would allow you to slip past my notice? Countess Rosikoff. Her expression hardens, a flicker of anger flashing in her eyes. You are so certain of yourself, Poirot, but you have no idea what it's like to be caught in the web of power and greed, to have to choose between loyalty to those who helped you rise and the fear that they will tear you down when they no longer find you useful. Poirot. His voice grows calm but carries a weight of unspoken truth. Fear, my dear Countess, is what makes criminals of us all. But there is another choice, isn't there? You could have chosen honesty, even in this mess. But instead, you choose to lie, to manipulate, to hide behind clever words. Countess Rosikoff. She laughs, but it's empty, bitter. Honesty, Poirot? And what good would that have done me? You of all people know what the world demands. It demands power, control. It doesn't care for truth unless it suits its own purposes. She shakes her head, a sad smile forming on her lips. If I had come to you sooner, if I had trusted you fully, would you have saved me from all of this? Or would you have turned me away like all the others? Poirot pauses for a moment, studying her closely. That, my dear Countess, is a question I cannot answer, because it's not a matter of saving you from yourself. No one can do that. He stands, moving toward the door, his tone now shifting to something almost melancholy. You see, Vera, the real question is, how much of this can you undo before it is too late? How much of your tangled web can be unraveled? Countess Rosikoff. She walks over to him, her hand trembling slightly as she reaches for his sleeve. Poirot, please, you've said it yourself. There is always a way out. Help me. I know the game is over, but I can still make it right if you will just... Poirot gently removes her hand, his eyes soft but unyielding. I cannot help you, Vera, not in the way you hope. But I will not stand in the way of what you choose next. He turns, looking back at her one last time. The question, as always, is, how far are you willing to go, to live with your own choices? The tension in the room was palpable as Hercule Poirot stood calmly, his eyes narrowing slightly as the Countess Rosikoff began speaking again, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and regret. I snatch it back, she exclaimed, gripping the velvet bag tightly in her hands. But as I feel through it, there's something hard inside. I slip my hand in, and that's when I know. I can tell just by touch. Jewels, Poirot. Jewels. And I know, instantly, who's behind this. It's that vile, deceitful, slippery snake, Paul Varesco. Poirot remained silent, the corners of his mouth twitching upward as he listened intently. The Countess paced the room, her footsteps sharp against the floor. She seemed to be unraveling, her face flushed with anger. Yes, I know. That filthy rat, that double-crossing lizard, Varesco, the one who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes, pretending to be a man of honor while he's smuggling drugs right under our noses. She pointed accusingly at Poirot. You've figured it all out, haven't you? You've been watching him from the start, pretending to be fooled. You knew what was going on, didn't you? Poirot's voice was calm, but filled with an almost imperceptible edge. Calm yourself, my dear Countess, he said softly. Come, let us step into the next room." He motioned toward a door at the far end of the room. As they entered, a small room loomed before them, seemingly filled with only one occupant, a large, imposing dog. The Countess gasped as her eyes locked onto the massive creature. "Mon Dieu, what is this?" she exclaimed, her hands going to her chest in shock. Poirot smiled, his tone almost playful as he introduced the small, nondescript man standing next to the beast. "Allow me to present Mr. William Higgs," Poirot announced, a true master of his craft. Mr. Higgs, during the chaotic events of the evening, succeeded in luring Cerberus out of his hell. The little man, Mr. Higgs, smiled bashfully, his rat-like features barely visible in the dim light. "Ah, well, Governor, it's a simple trick, really. Dogs, see? They're not so hard to handle when you know what to offer them," he muttered, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Give 'em what they want, and they'll follow you anywhere." The Countess stared at the man, confusion written all over her face. "What do you mean? How could you possibly have gotten Cerberus to follow you?" Mr. Higgs scratched his chin, looking embarrassed but amused. "Ah, it's not so complicated, ma'am. Dogs, especially ones trained for a job, they're loyal. You just show 'em the right thing, and they'll do anything for you. Cerberus here is no different. He's just a dog with a very big mouth." The Countess blinked in disbelief, her attention now fixed entirely on Cerberus, who had barely moved save for the rhythmic thumping of his tail. "But why? Why are you showing me this?" Poirot, his face serious now, stepped forward. "Ah, my dear, it is all part of the plan. You see, Cerberus carries something very important, and the question is, what does he carry? Watch closely." With a gentle yet deliberate motion, Poirot reached into the dog's mouth and pulled out a small, pink package wrapped in rubber. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small but highly dangerous packet of white powder, cocaine. The Countess gasped, her face turning pale. "What is this? What does this mean, Poirot?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. Poirot's expression remained calm, but his words were laced with warning. "Cocaine, my dear Countess. A small amount, yes, but enough to bring ruin, enough to destroy lives and turn innocent lives into victims of greed and power." She took a step back, shaking her head. "No, no, you must be mistaken. I had no idea, Poirot, I swear to you, I had no idea my hell was being used for such an abhorrent purpose." Poirot shook his head slowly, his voice filled with disappointment. "I do not doubt you, Vera, but it is the people you associate with, the ones you allow into your world, that cause the damage, the ones who take advantage of your trust. Tell me, who was it that hid this in Cerberus's mouth?" She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze shifting between Poirot and the dog. I don't know. I couldn't have known," she stammered. Poirot's eyes softened, but his words were still firm. "I know, my dear, but someone knew, someone used you, and if not for the careful eye of Hercule Poirot, you might have been caught in their web." The Countess crumpled into a chair, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, my Niki," she whispered. "What will become of him? What will happen to him now?" Poirot stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Do not worry. There are many other opportunities for young men like him in America, and you, Vera, have saved him from a far worse fate. Thanks to your actions, his future remains bright." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You think so?" she asked, her voice trembling. Poirot nodded, a small but reassuring smile gracing his lips. "Indeed, but for you, your son's future would be compromised, trapped in a world of crime. Now, he has the chance to start anew. You have made the right choice." The Countess closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. "Thank you, Thank you, Poirot. You are truly a genius." She reached up, and in a spontaneous burst of emotion, she wrapped her arms around him in an embrace. Poirot stood still for a moment, taken aback by the sudden affection, but allowed her to hold him for just a few seconds before gently pulling away. Mr. Higgs, observing the scene with a knowing look, remarked, "Well, Governor, that's a fine way to solve a case. But, what about the dog? Cerberus, he's not going back to hell, is he?" Poirot gave a slight chuckle, adjusting his bow tie as he stood upright. "Ah, Cerberus is not my problem, Higgs. He returned to hell just as planned. But as for the rest of this, well, let's just say that the truth has come to light, and those who need to know it will." A week later, as Poirot sat in his office, Miss Lemon came in with an envelope, handing him a bill. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Is it all right for me to pay this? It's from Leonora Florist. Red roses, £11, 8 shillings and sixpence. Sent to Countess Vera Rosakoff." Poirot's face flushed, a rare sight for the meticulous detective. He cleared his throat and straightened his jacket. "Ah, Miss Lemon, perfectly in order. A small gesture, a tribute, if you will, a celebration of new beginnings." Miss Lemon raised an eyebrow. "I see, but you're blushing." Poirot chuckled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "There are moments, Miss Lemon, when one does not economize. When the occasion calls for it, one does what is necessary." And with that, Hercule Poirot walked out of his office, humming a cheerful tune, his step light, almost sprightly. Miss Lemon stood by her desk, watching him go, her curiosity piqued. "Good gracious," she muttered. "I wonder, could it be?" Poirot's response, though unspoken, was clear. In the game of life, sometimes even the greatest of detectives allow themselves a moment of mystery. Bookie.com, I'm telling you, it's a sure thing. My friend grinned, leaning back in his chair, a little too pleased with himself. "It's all settled then. You're coming with me." "And where, may I ask, are you dragging me off to?" "Brighton," he declared with a dramatic flourish. "A friend in the city gave me a tip. Let's just say I'm in a position to splurge a little. A weekend at the Grand Metropolitan is just what we need." "Well," I said, unable to resist, "thank you. I'll come with pleasure. It's rather thoughtful of you to include me in this extravagance." Poirot, sitting beside me, smiled warmly. "Ah, Hastings, it is always the heart that triumphs in the end, not the gray cells. Yes, even I must remind myself of that sometimes." His words had a hint of condescension, as if he were gently poking fun at my intellect. It stung, but his excitement was contagious, so I chose to let it slide. By Saturday evening, we were dining at the Grand Metropolitan amidst a dazzling sea of fashion and elegance. The crowd was abuzz with energy, and the room shimmered with an array of extravagant jewelry, some worn with more enthusiasm than taste. "Magnificent, isn't it?" murmured Poirot, surveying the opulence around us. "The perfect playground for the wealthy, and for the criminally inclined." "Brighton has its reputation," I replied, smiling. Poirot's gaze lingered on a stout woman near a pillar, her neck and wrists glinting with jewels. "Look there, Hastings, that one is practically draped in treasure. What a tempting sight for a thief of distinction, no?" I followed his gaze and recognized her immediately. "That's Mrs. Opalson," I exclaimed. "She's married to a stockbroker who made his fortune in the oil boom. Later, we encountered the Opalsons in the lounge, and I introduced Poirot to the couple." Over coffee, Mrs. Opalson lit up as Poirot complimented the sparkling gems adorning her neck. "Jewelry is my passion, Mr. Poirot," she gushed. "Ed knows it too. Whenever he does well, he treats me to something new." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, madame, I have had the pleasure of encountering many extraordinary jewels in my career. Each stone has its story." He launched into a tale of a legendary set of jewels once owned by royalty, his words weaving a spell. Mrs. Opalson listened, captivated, her breath bated. When he finished, she clapped her hands together. "Oh, how marvelous! You know, I have a pearl necklace with its own fascinating history. It's said to be one of the finest in the world. The pearls are perfectly matched, just exquisite. You must see it." Poirot protested politely. "Madame, I could not ask you to go to such trouble." "Nonsense, I'll fetch it right now," she insisted, bustling off toward the lift with surprising speed. Her husband chuckled, shaking his head. "The pearls are worth a fortune. Cost me a small fortune, too, but they're an investment. I could sell them tomorrow and get every penny back, maybe even more, the way things are going in the city." He began rambling about the financial markets, though most of it went over my head. A small page boy interrupted us, whispering something in his ear. Opalson frowned, nodded, and excused himself. Poirot, calm as ever, watched the exchange with quiet interest. "A simple necklace," he said softly. "And yet, what trouble it could invite. I'll come at once. Not sick, is she?" Mr. Opalson's face tightened as he abruptly excused himself, leaving us behind. Poirot leaned back, calm as ever, and lit one of his dainty Russian cigarettes. With precise care, he rearranged the empty coffee cups in a perfect line, a contented smile spreading across his face as if he had just solved a puzzle. Minutes ticked by. Still no sign of the Opalsons. I glanced at my watch. "Curious," I murmured. "What's keeping them so long?" Poirot exhaled a thin spiral of smoke, his eyes thoughtful. "They will not come back." I frowned. "What? Why not?" "My dear Hastings," he said, his voice low but steady, "something has happened." I leaned closer, intrigued. "Happened? What do you mean? How do you know?" Poirot raised a hand, motioning for patience. "A few moments ago, the hotel manager rushed upstairs in a state of great agitation. The lift boy, meanwhile, has been deep in conversation with a page, ignoring the lift bell that rang thrice. And finally, the waiters— Ah, Hastings! Even the waiters are distracted. To make a waiter distrait? That is no small affair. Mon ami, the situation must be of the highest magnitude." I opened my mouth to respond, but Poirot raised a brow and nodded toward the entrance. "Voila, as I suspected, here come the police." Two men had entered the hotel, one in uniform, the other plain-clothed. After speaking briefly with a page, they disappeared upstairs. Moments later, the same page boy approached us. "Mr. Opalson's compliments, sir, and would you please come upstairs?" Poirot sprang to his feet, his movements as nimble as a cat. "Come, Hastings," he called, already heading for the stairs. I hurried after him, my pulse quickening. The Opalson suite was located on the first floor. A sharp knock from the page boy was met with a muffled, "Come in." When we stepped inside, the scene that greeted us could only be described as chaos. In the center of the room, Mrs. Opalson sat slumped in a chair, her broad frame trembling as she sobbed uncontrollably. Her heavily powdered face was streaked with tears, the pale foundation smeared into uneven patches. Mr. Opalson paced the room like a caged tiger, his steps heavy with frustration. Two police officers stood near the center of the room, one jotting notes in a small notebook, the other scanning the scene with an air of disinterest. A terrified chambermaid hovered by the fireplace, her hands wringing nervously. On the opposite side of the room, a Frenchwoman, evidently Mrs. Opalson's maid, sobbed into a handkerchief, her anguish almost theatrical in its intensity. Poirot entered the room with a calm and confident smile. utterly unfazed by the commotion. Mrs. Opalson, spotting him, shot up from her chair with surprising speed. "Oh, Mr. Poirot," she cried, clasping her hands together. "It's fate, I tell you. Fate. Meeting you tonight was a sign. If anyone can get my pearls back, it's you." Poirot stepped forward, taking her hand with a gentle pat. "Calm yourself, madam. Rest assured, Hercule Poirot will aid you. All will be well." Mr. Opalson turned to the police inspector, his voice gruff. "I hope there's no objection to me calling in Mr. Poirot?" "None at all, sir," the inspector replied with a casual shrug. "Perhaps now, Mrs. Opalson, you can tell us exactly what happened." The lady looked helplessly at Poirot, who led her back to her chair with a reassuring nod. "Take a deep breath, madam, and recount the events. Do not distress yourself further." Mrs. Opalson dabbed her eyes and began, her voice trembling. "I came upstairs after dinner to fetch my pearls. The chambermaid and Celestine, my maid, were both in the room, as usual." Poirot raised a hand. "Pardon, madam, but what do you mean by 'as usual'?" Mr. Opalson interjected. "No one is allowed into this room unless Celestine is present. It's a strict rule of mine. The chambermaid does her work in the morning under Celestine's watch and only returns in the evening to turn down the beds, again with Celestine present. Otherwise the room is locked." Mrs. Opalson nodded quickly. "Yes, exactly. So I went to the dressing table." She gestured toward a polished knee-hole table on the far side of the room. "I opened the bottom right drawer where I keep my jewel case. It was locked just as I'd left it, but when I unlocked it—" Her voice cracked, and she clutched her throat. "The pearls, they were gone." The inspector, still scribbling in his notebook, looked up. "When did you last see them?" "This evening, before dinner," she replied firmly. "I wasn't sure whether to wear the pearls or my emeralds. I chose the emeralds and put the pearls back in the case, locking it before heading downstairs." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he leaned forward. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Did you wear the key on a chain around your neck?" the inspector asked, examining the key Mrs. Opalson had just produced. Mrs. Opalson nodded. "Yes, of course." The inspector shrugged, clearly unconcerned. "Ah, the thief must have had a duplicate key then. Not a difficult matter. Your lock is quite simple." Mrs. Opalson frowned, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "But what about the drawer? I always leave it unlocked." The inspector's gaze sharpened. "So, to confirm, the jewels were in the case when you went to dinner, and since then the maid hasn't left the room?" Suddenly, as if struck by the weight of the situation, Celestine, Mrs. Opalson's maid, let out a blood-curdling shriek, throwing herself at Poirot. "Infamous!" she cried, her voice rising in furious French. "How dare you accuse me of this crime? You think I would steal from Madame? The police, they're so stupid." Poirot raised a hand to silence her, his voice cool. "Madam, I must ask that you calm yourself." But Celestine wasn't listening. Her rage boiled over. "That chambermaid, she's the thief. She's always been a thief, a liar. I've watched her since she started working here." She gestured wildly, her words spilling forth in a rapid torrent of French. The chambermaid stood, stiff as a board, but then spoke with cold defiance. "It's a lie. I didn't take the pearls." "Oh, but you did," Celestine retorted, her eyes blazing. "Search her. You'll find them on her, I'm sure of it." The chambermaid's eyes narrowed in fury. "You're mad, Celestine. Why don't you look at yourself first? You're the one who's always sneaking around." Poirot stepped in, his voice steady as he addressed Celestine. "Is it true, Celestine? Did you leave the room?" Celestine hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "I didn't leave her alone, but I did go into my own room twice. To fetch some cotton and my scissors, that's all." The chambermaid snorted. "A minute, if that. You were barely gone. Meanwhile, you sat like a cat watching a mouse from your chair." Poirot remained calm, but the tension in the room thickened. Just then, there was a knock at the door. The inspector moved swiftly to open it, his face lighting up at the sight of the newcomer. "Ah, perfect timing," he said. "I've called for one of our female searchers and she's just arrived." He turned to the chambermaid. "If you wouldn't mind stepping into the next room." The chambermaid tossed her head, striding across the threshold with a haughty look. The searcher followed close behind her. Celestine slumped into a chair, tears of frustration brimming in her eyes. Poirot stood, surveying the room with his usual intensity. The inspector approached Poirot, his voice curious. "Where does that door lead?" he asked, nodding toward the door by the window. Poirot glanced at it, eyes narrowing. "That leads into the next apartment," he said, moving toward it. "But it's bolted on this side." Poirot tried the door anyway. He pushed back the bolt, checking the mechanism. Then he tried the door again, inspecting the other side. "Well," he said, stepping back, "that seems to rule out that possibility." Poirot moved to the windows next, scrutinizing each one with meticulous care. He checked every angle, but there was nothing. No balcony, no escape route. Just a dead end. "Even if there were," said the inspector, growing impatient, "I still don't see how that helps us. The maid never left the room." "Ah, but you're overlooking something, my friend," Poirot replied, unshaken. "Mademoiselle insists she never left." Before the inspector could respond, the chambermaid and the police searcher returned. "Nothing," the searcher reported flatly. "I should hope not," the chambermaid chimed in, her tone prim and self-righteous. "That French hussy should be ashamed, accusing me of stealing her pearls." There, my girl, it's all right," the inspector said, opening the door. "No one suspects you. Go along and get back to your duties." The chambermaid hesitated, glancing at Celestine. "Go search her instead," she demanded. Yes, the inspector replied, shutting the door behind the chambermaid. "Go along now, no more fuss." Celestine and the searcher went into the small adjoining room. A few minutes later, Celestine reappeared, and the inspector's expression darkened. "Nothing," she muttered, still visibly shaken. The inspector sighed, his tone now grim. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with me, mademoiselle," he said to Celestine. Turning to Mrs. Opelson, he added, "I'm sorry, madam, but all the evidence points that way. If she hasn't got them on her, then they must be hidden somewhere in the room." At that, Celestine let out a blood-curdling shriek and clung to Poirot's arm, shaking uncontrollably. Poirot bent down, whispering something in her ear. She looked up at him, confused, but he gave her a reassuring nod. "Come now," he said softly. "It's better not to resist." Turning to the inspector, he asked, "May I propose a little experiment purely for my own satisfaction?" The inspector raised an eyebrow. "It depends on what it is," he replied, his tone non-committal. Poirot turned to Celestine again. "You told us you went to your room to fetch a reel of cotton. Where was it?" "On the top of the chest of drawers," Celestine replied. "And the scissors?" Poirot pressed. Celestine nodded, clearly nervous. "Yes, the scissors were there too." "Would it be too much trouble, mademoiselle," Poirot asked, "to repeat those actions for me?" Celestine, clearly unsure of what was happening, reluctantly rose at Poirot's signal. She moved into the adjoining room, picked up an object from the chest of drawers and returned. Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, divided his attention between her movements and the large, turnip-like watch he held in his hand. "Once more, if you please, mademoiselle," Poirot requested. After the second performance, Poirot made a note in his pocketbook and carefully returned the watch to his pocket. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said politely, bowing to her. Celestine, in a fit of tears, was escorted away by the female searcher and the plain-clothes officer. The inspector, now growing somewhat entertained by Poirot's peculiar methods, turned to Mrs. Opelson with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, madam," the inspector said, "but I must proceed with the search." He immediately set to work, pulling out drawers, opening cupboards, unmaking the bed, and tapping the floor for hidden compartments. Mr. Opelson watched skeptically from the corner. "You really think you'll find them?" he asked, voice dripping with doubt. "Yes, sir," Poirot answered calmly. "It stands to reason. She had no time to remove them from the room. The discovery was made too soon. They're here, right enough." "One of the two must have hidden them," Poirot continued, "and it's highly unlikely the chambermaid did so. More than unlikely, impossible." The inspector stared at him, stunned. Poirot smiled modestly. "I will demonstrate, Hastings, my good friend." He pulled out his watch. "Take care with it. It is a family heirloom." Poirot looked at the watch with intense concentration. "Just now, I timed Mademoiselle's movements. Her first absence from the room lasted precisely 12 seconds. The second was 15 inches. He glanced up, meeting the inspector's gaze. "Now, observe carefully, madame," Poirot said gently. "Will you have the kindness to give me the key to the jewel case?" His voice was smooth, yet there was an air of quiet authority. "I thank you," he added, turning toward me with a glint in his eyes. "Hastings, will you have the kindness to say, 'Go'?" Before I could respond, Poirot moved with lightning speed. In a single, fluid motion, he wrenched open the drawer of the dressing table, retrieved the jewel case, and with expert precision slid the key into the lock. The case clicked open, and Poirot selected a piece of jewelry with deliberate care. He shut the case, locked it, and returned it to the drawer, pushing it shut once again. His movements were so swift they were almost too fast to follow. "Well, mon ami," Poirot asked, his eyes twinkling, "how long did that take?" 46 seconds, I replied, still astonished by the efficiency of his actions. Poirot turned to the inspector. "You see," he said calmly, "there would not have been time for the chambermaid to even take the necklace out, let alone hide it." The inspector's face brightened. "Then that settles it. The maid is the thief," he said with evident satisfaction, returning to his search. Poirot, however, was deep in thought. As the inspector moved into the maid's bedroom next door, Poirot turned to Mr. Opelson. "This necklace," he asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "It was undoubtedly insured." Mr. Opelson seemed momentarily taken aback by the question. "Yes," he said slowly, "but what does that matter?" Mrs. Opelson burst into the conversation, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's my necklace. It was unique. No money could ever replace it. I comprehend, madam," Poirot soothed, nodding sympathetically. "But perhaps Monsieur Opelson will find some slight consolation in the insurance value." "Of course," Mr. Opelson agreed, though his tone was uncertain. He was about to say more when the inspector returned, triumphantly dangling something from his fingers. "Mrs. Opelson," the inspector exclaimed, "look what I've found." Mrs. Opelson leapt from her chair with a gasp. "Oh, my necklace!" she cried, clutching it to her chest with both hands. We crowded around her, and the inspector, still beaming, gestured toward the maid's bed. "It was hidden in the springs of the mattress," he declared. "She must have stolen it and concealed it there before the chambermaid arrived on the scene." Poirot, ever the picture of calm, nodded, and stepped forward. "Madame," he said gently, "you permit?" He took the necklace from her, examining it with the scrutiny of an expert. Poirot's fingers traced the delicate design, and after a moment he handed the necklace back with a bow. "I'm afraid, madam, you will have to hand it over to us for the time being," he said politely. "We shall want it for the charge, but it shall be returned to you as soon as possible." Mr. Opalson frowned. "Is that necessary?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm afraid so, sir," the inspector replied. "It's just a formality." Mrs. Opalson, clearly desperate, urged him on. "Let him take it," she cried. "I'd feel safer if he did. I wouldn't sleep a wink thinking someone else might try and steal it. That wretched girl." There, my dear," Mr. Opalson said, attempting to comfort his wife. I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. It was Poirot. "Shall we slip away, my friend?" he suggested quietly. "I think our services are no longer needed here." Once outside, however, Poirot paused, his brow furrowing in thought. "I should like to see the room next door," he said after a moment. I was taken aback. "What for?" "It will help," he replied, his voice thoughtful. We entered the large, unoccupied room next door, and as soon as Poirot saw the dust on the furniture, he grimaced. "The service leaves much to be desired," he observed dryly, running his finger around a rectangular mark on a table near the window. Poirot stared out the window, deep in thought, seemingly lost in his own world. "What is it?" I asked impatiently. "What did we come in here for?" Poirot turned slowly, his gaze still distant. "I wanted to see if the door was really bolted on this side," he said at last. I glanced at the door that connected the two rooms. "It's bolted," I confirmed. "But what does it matter? The case is over." Poirot shook his head, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "The case is not over, my friend. It will not be over until we find out who stole the pearls." "But the maid did," I protested. Poirot smiled placidly. "Non, mon ami, those pearls were not the real ones." The words struck me like a thunderclap. "What? But the necklace was found in her mattress." Poirot nodded, still calm. "Ah, my friend, those were not the true pearls. They were merely imitation." I was speechless. "But how can you be sure?" Poirot's smile widened. "It's simple, Hastings. The good inspector obviously knows nothing about jewels, but soon there will be quite a commotion, mark my words." I was flabbergasted. "We must tell the Opalsons." Poirot's expression grew serious. "I think not, my friend. That poor woman—" "You mean Mrs. Opalson?" Yes, Poirot continued. "She will sleep better tonight, believing the jewels are safe. The thief, however, may still escape with them. We must wait." I shook my head, confused. "How do you know they aren't the real ones?" Poirot gave me a long, knowing look. "How do you know that the pearls Mrs. Opalson locked away tonight weren't false to begin with? Perhaps the real robbery happened much earlier." I was stunned. "But how?" Poirot grinned. "Exactly. You see now." With a dramatic flourish, Poirot led me out of the room, pausing briefly as if considering something, then heading toward the small den at the end of the corridor where the chambermaids and valets gathered. "Let's see what we can learn here, my friend," Poirot murmured. She appeared to be holding court, recounting her recent experiences to a captivated audience. In the middle of a sentence, she suddenly paused as Poirot entered the room with his signature polite bow. "Excuse me, madame. I beg your pardon for disturbing you," Poirot said smoothly. "But I would be grateful if you could kindly unlock Mr. Opalson's room for me." Rose, the chambermaid, readily complied, and we followed her down the corridor once again. Mr. Opalson's room was on the opposite side. its door facing his wife's. With a deft twist of her passkey, Rose unlocked the door, allowing us to enter. Before she left, Poirot called her back. "One moment, mademoiselle. Have you ever seen this among Mr. Opalson's effects?" He held out a plain white card, its surface highly glazed and almost unusual in appearance. The maid took it and studied it closely, her brow furrowing. "No, sir," she replied. "I can't say I have, but the valet handles most of Mr. Opalson's things." "Thank you," Poirot said, taking the card back. Rose departed, and Poirot seemed to drift into thought. "Ring for the valet, Hastings," he instructed suddenly. "3 times, please." I did as he asked, my curiosity growing. Poirot, however, was already focused on the wastepaper basket, emptying its contents onto the floor and sifting through them with remarkable speed. A moment later, the valet entered, and Poirot asked the same question, handing him the card to inspect. The response was the same as before. The valet had never seen such a card in Mr. Opalson's belongings. Poirot thanked him, and the valet left with a look of mild curiosity at the scattered papers. He couldn't have missed Poirot's muttered remark as he carefully gathered the torn bits back together. And the necklace was heavily insured. I blinked. "Poirot, I see." Poirot gave me a sidelong glance, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, you see nothing, my friend. Nothing at all. It is incredible, but there it is." With that, Poirot gestured for us to return to our rooms. Once there, to my complete surprise, Poirot quickly began changing his clothes. "I'm leaving for London tonight," he explained, his voice firm. "It is imperative." "London?" I repeated, a little stunned. "But why?" "The real work, Hastings," Poirot replied with a dramatic pause, his eyes lighting up with the familiar gleam of his little gray cells at work. "It is done. I go to seek the confirmation." "Poirot, you're going to come a cropper one of these days," I remarked, a touch of exasperation in my voice. He ignored my comment with a serene smile. "Do not be angry, mon ami. I am counting on you to do me a small favor, as a friend." "Of course, Poirot," I agreed eagerly, though somewhat baffled. "What is it?" Poirot gestured to his coat, which he had just removed. "This sleeve," he said, pointing to a small patch of white powder. "Will you brush it for me? You no doubt saw me run my finger around the drawer of the dressing table." I hadn't noticed, but I obediently took the coat and examined the sleeve. "What is this powder, Poirot?" I asked, not particularly interested in his usual antics. "Ah, not poison, Hastings," he replied with a twinkle in his eye. "It is not the poison of the Boers, no." I blinked, intrigued. "Then what is it?" "French chalk," Poirot said simply, his smile widening. "French chalk?" I repeated, confused. "Yes," Poirot confirmed. "Cabinet makers use it to make drawers run smoothly." I laughed, relieved. "Ah, Poirot, I thought you were building up to something more dramatic." Poirot chuckled lightly. "Mon ami, I save myself, I fly." With that, he swiftly left, the door shutting behind him with a half-affectionate, half-derisive smile. I stood there, a bit taken aback by his sudden departure. Shaking my head, I reached for the clothes brush, still pondering Poirot's odd behavior. The next morning, hearing nothing from Poirot, I decided to take a stroll to clear my mind. It was an unusual day, and I had a growing sense that something far more interesting than we had yet discovered was about to unfold. The afternoon passed quickly as I lunched with some old friends at their hotel. We went for a drive afterward, but a punctured tire delayed us. By the time I returned to the Grand Metropolitan, it was already past 8. The first sight that greeted me was Poirot, looking even smaller than usual, squeezed between the Opalsons, both of them beaming with satisfaction. "Hastings!" Poirot cried, rushing over to embrace me. My friend, all has gone marvelously." I froze, unsure what to make of it. The embrace was, fortunately, figurative, something I always find myself unsure of with Poirot. "Do you mean—" I began, still trying to piece things together. "Wonderful, I call it," Mrs. Opelson said, her wide smile practically taking over her face. "Didn't I tell you, Ed, that if he couldn't get back my pearls, no one would?" "You did, my dear, you did," Mr. Opelson agreed, a hint of pride in his voice. I looked helplessly at Poirot, seeking an explanation. He caught my glance and answered with a casual shrug. "My friend," he said with a twinkle, "as they say in England, all at the seaside, seat yourself, and I will recount to you the affair that has ended so happily." "Ended?" I repeated, still confused. "Of course they are arrested," Poirot continued. "Arrested? Who?" "The chambermaid and the valet," Poirot replied, looking pleased with himself. "You did not suspect?" I stared at him, stunned. "Not with my parting hint about the French chalk," he said knowingly. "Cabinet makers use it to make drawers slide easily, but someone wanted that drawer to slide without making a sound. Who, I wonder?" His voice dropped into a tone of quiet satisfaction. Only the truly dynamic and bold could pull that off. The plan, so brilliantly conceived, was not immediately apparent, not even to the sharp eyes of Hercule Poirot himself. "Here is what happened," Poirot explained, with that glint in his eyes that made even the most seemingly ordinary situations feel like masterful plots. The valet was waiting in the empty room next door, concealed and ready. The French maid leaves, swift as a shadow. That's when the chambermaid swoops in. She opens the drawer, grabs the jewel case, and with a speed born of careful practice, slips the bolt back on the door. She passes it through the door to the valet, who has the duplicate key to open it at his leisure. Poirot paused for dramatic effect, knowing I was on the edge of my seat. He takes the necklace, stashes it away, and waits for the perfect moment. The maid comes back, the case is passed back again, and is swiftly replaced in the drawer. Madame enters. The theft is discovered. The chambermaid, with feigned horror, demands to be searched and, of course, leaves the room without a speck of guilt to her name. I stared, trying to grasp the depth of it all. Poirot's smile was all-knowing. And the final touch, mon ami. The imitation necklace was cleverly hidden in the French maid's bed earlier that morning. A masterpiece of misdirection, wouldn't you agree? "But what about your trip to London?" I asked, eager to piece the puzzle together. Poirot's eyes sparkled with delight as he continued. "You remember the card? It puzzled me too, but it was all part of the plan. A special surface for fingerprints. I went straight to Scotland Yard and consulted our old friend, the inspector. As I suspected, the prints were from two notorious jewel thieves who had been evading the law for some time. The moment I arrived, I laid the facts out. We took the thieves down together, and there, hidden on the valet, the necklace." Poirot smiled in that infuriatingly modest way of his. "A clever pair," he conceded, "but they missed one thing: method. As I've told you, Hastings, at least 36 times, a plan without method is doomed to fail." I couldn't help but laugh. 36,000, more like. Poirot raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You see, mon ami, they made a critical error. Yes, taking the role of a chambermaid or a valet is clever, but one must not skip the details. They left the room undusted. When the valet placed the jewel case on the small table near the door, he left a telltale mark. A square, perfectly visible mark. I blinked. Of course. I remember now. Mrs. Opelson, having overheard, chimed in with a dramatic flourish. "And I've got my pearls back." Poirot gave a satisfied nod. "Exactly, madame." I turned to Poirot. "Well, I suppose dinner is in order." He looked at me with a knowing smile. "Indeed, it is. But I must say, Hastings, this should earn you some kudos. However, the local inspector will divide the credit with the rest of us." He tapped his pocket as if he were a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. "And here, mon ami, is the check Mr. Opelson kindly sent me." I raised an eyebrow. "And what about us?" "What's next?" Poirot, ever the mystery, gave a small shrug. "Shall we return next weekend?" My treat. And just like that, the case was over, or so I thought. But with Poirot, nothing is ever truly over.